Welcome back. Tonight, we're stepping into the shadowed halls where a blue rabbit waits in the darkness, where the soft padding of animatronic feet approaches from corridors you cannot see, where a guitarist's silhouette stands motionless until the moment you look away. This is the story of Bonnie, the animatronic that gave his creator nightmares, the character who defined what it meant to be truly afraid in a children's pizzeria, and the rabbit whose many forms have haunted the Five Nights at Freddy's franchise since its very beginning. From the original blue bunny who stalked the left hallway of a decrepit restaurant, to the decayed golden shell that trapped a murderer's soul for decades. From the withered horror missing half his face to the glamorous rock star whose absence speaks louder than his presence. Bonnie has worn many faces across this series. Each iteration tells its own piece of a larger, darker puzzle about entertainment turned nightmare, about souls trapped in mechanical prisons, and about how something designed to bring joy to children became an instrument of terror and tragedy. Whether you're discovering these details for the first time, revisiting familiar territory with fresh perspective, or simply letting the narrative wash over you like a gentle tide as sleep takes hold, we'll explore every corner of Bonnie's existence. We'll trace the threads from his creation at Fredbear's Family Diner, through decades of decay and resurrection. Examine the child whose spirit gave him unnatural life. Understand why Scott Cawthon considers him the most frightening of his creations, and uncover the mysteries that still surround his most recent incarnation in the Mega Pizzaplex. This journey will take us through every game, every appearance, every hint and clue about this iconic character. We'll understand the mechanics that made him terrifying, the lore that made him tragic, and the design choices that made him unforgettable. So settle in, let the darkness wrap around you like a comfortable blanket, and let's begin our exploration of Bonnie the Rabbit, the animatronic who proved that sometimes the scariest monsters wear bow ties and play guitar. Before we dive deeper, feel free to like and subscribe if you enjoy this kind of thorough, immersive storytelling that unfolds like a dream. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what your first encounter with Bonnie was. It's always fascinating to hear how different people experience these scares, one quiet night at a time. The original Bonnie, where terror began, in the dimly lit corridors of the original Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, where flickering lights cast dancing shadows and the air hung heavy with the scent of stale pizza and machinery. There stood an animatronic rabbit who would define horror for a generation of players. Bonnie the Rabbit, standing approximately 6 feet tall with his guitar held in mechanical hands, represented something that Scott Cawthon himself would later admit gave him genuine nightmares during development. This wasn't just another character in a horror game. This was fear given physical form, wrapped in blue fabric and topped with a red bow tie. The original Bonnie's design struck a perfect balance between the familiar and the uncanny. His body was coated in a bluish-purple fabric that, depending on the lighting of the pizzeria, could appear more blue or more purple, a color ambiguity that would spark debates among fans for years to come. His face featured large, expressive eyes with magenta irises and black pupils, eyes that seemed to follow you even when he stood perfectly still. The rabbit's muzzle was squared and somewhat blocky, painted in a lighter lavender shade that extended to his stomach, and the insides of his segmented ears. Those ears, capable of bending backward and forward through articulated joints, gave him an almost lifelike quality when they twitched during his movements. Bonnie wore his signature red bow tie with a neck strap that disappeared partially under his chin, a splash of color that seemed almost cheerful if you could ignore the context of where you encountered him. His hands ended in 3 fingers and a thumb, simple in design, but capable of gripping his red electric guitar, the instrument that defined his role in Freddy's band. During daylight hours, when the pizzeria buzzed with children's laughter and birthday celebrations, Bonnie would stand on the show stage alongside Freddy Fazbear and Chica, entertaining crowds with programmed songs and movements. He was the guitarist, the cool one, Freddy's right-hand rabbit. But when night fell and the doors locked, something changed. Bonnie became active, driven by forces that the original game only hinted at through cryptic phone calls and newspaper clippings scattered throughout the gameplay. He would leave his position on the show stage and begin a methodical journey through the restaurant, appearing in various rooms as he made his way toward the security office, where you, the night guard, sat defenseless behind a metal desk, with limited power and closing doors as your only protection. Bonnie's path took him through the dining area first, where tables sat empty and party hats littered the floor. From there, he might move to the backstage, a cluttered room filled with spare animatronic parts and endoskeletons hanging on the walls like gruesome trophies. The supply closet was another frequent stop, a small space packed with cleaning supplies and equipment, where Bonnie's large frame seemed impossibly cramped. Then came the West Hall, a long corridor leading toward your office, where camera feeds would show him getting closer, his face filling more of the screen with each check. Finally, he would reach the West Hall corner, the blind spot just outside your left door. This was where Bonnie became most dangerous. When he stood in that corner, your camera couldn't see him. Your only warning was the sudden silence when you checked the camera and found the hallway empty, a silence that meant one thing. He was right outside your door, waiting for the perfect moment to move in. The mechanics of dealing with Bonnie created a resource management nightmare that elevated simple jump scares into sustained psychological tension. Every action in the game consumed power from a limited supply that had to last until 6 in the morning. Checking cameras, turning on lights, closing doors, all of it drained your battery. If you ran out of power before dawn, everything would go dark. Freddy's music box would begin to play, and death would follow moments later. So you had to balance checking Bonnie's position with conserving power, never knowing if this time he'd be in the backstage or already at your door. When Bonnie did appear at your door, you had mere seconds to react. Close the door too early, and you'd waste precious power. Close it too late, and his jump scare would erupt across your screen. His face lunging forward as static consumed everything, his mechanical screech cutting through the silence like a knife. Game over. Try again. That jump scare, with its sudden violence and the way Bonnie seemed to phase through the door into your space, became iconic. It wasn't just scary in the moment. It created lasting dread, making every camera check an exercise in mounting tension as you wondered if this would be the time he'd be standing right there, staring into the lens. Scott Cawthon has been open about the fact that Bonnie gave him nightmares during the game's development. While programming the AI and testing mechanics, he would accidentally trigger jump scares that caught even him, the creator who knew exactly how everything worked, completely off guard. There was something about Bonnie specifically, something in the way he moved or the way his face looked when caught in the security camera's grainy footage, that bypassed rational knowledge and struck directly at primal fear. Scott has described Bonnie as the scariest animatronic in the entire franchise, scarier than any of the more obviously monstrous designs that would come in later games. Part of what made Bonnie so effective as a horror element was his unpredictability. While all the animatronics in the first game had AI patterns, Bonnie was known for what fans affectionately called teleporting. He could move from the backstage to the supply closet between camera checks in ways that seemed to violate the physical layout of the pizzeria. Scott would later joke that Bonnie does not abide by the laws of space, time, and physics, a statement that, while humorous, captured something genuine about how the character functioned in gameplay. You could never fully predict where he'd be next, couldn't create a reliable strategy that worked every time. Bonnie forced you to stay alert, to check constantly, to never get comfortable. The Celebrate poster added another layer of unease to Bonnie's presence. On rare occasions, when checking certain cameras, players would see a poster on the wall showing all the animatronics in a cheerful group shot. But sometimes, very rarely, that poster would change to show Bonnie, and only Bonnie, seemingly closer to the camera, his expression slightly different. Even stranger, in this poster, Bonnie appeared to be slightly floating, hovering above the ground in a way that defied the physical reality of animatronic entertainment robots. This subtle detail, easy to miss but impossible to forget once noticed, suggested that something more than mechanical programming drove these characters. Behind Bonnie's terrifying exterior and relentless pursuit lived a tragic truth that players would only fully understand as the series revealed more of its lore. Bonnie wasn't just a malfunctioning machine. He was possessed, inhabited by the spirit of a child who had been murdered within the pizzeria's walls decades earlier. The missing children incident, referenced in newspaper clippings and revealed through secret minigames, told the story of 5 young victims lured to a back room by someone wearing a mascot suit, someone who would kill them and hide their bodies inside the animatronic characters themselves. The child possessing Bonnie appears to be named Jeremy, based on the alignment of gravestones in Pizzeria Simulator's Lawkeeper, ending with the animatronic head positions shown in FNAF 3's Good Ending. Jeremy had been one of those 5 children, one of the victims whose life was stolen in what should have been a place of joy and celebration. When the killer stuffed Jeremy's body into Bonnie's animatronic shell, something happened that defied natural law. The child's spirit, unable to pass on, unable to comprehend what had been done to it, merged with the machinery. It became the machinery. And in that fusion of soul and circuit board, Bonnie gained a kind of malevolent awareness, a drive to attack anyone it perceived as a threat, particularly adult men in security uniforms who might resemble the killer. This possession explained why Bonnie and the other animatronics moved at night despite having no reason to, from a programming standpoint. It explained why they seemed to hunt with purpose, why they would stuff any person they caught into a spare animatronic suit in a twisted recreation of what had been done to them. The spirits inside these machines were confused, traumatized, seeking some form of justice or revenge that they couldn't articulate even to themselves. They saw adults as potential threats, as possible iterations of the person who had hurt them, and they responded with the only kind of action they knew: attack, capture, stuff into a suit. Scott Cawthon would later describe these possessed animatronics as having what he called animal-like instincts, suggesting they operated on confused impulses rather than clear understanding. This characterization helps explain their behavior within the game's internal logic. They weren't sophisticated enough to distinguish between innocent security guards and the actual murderer, instead responding with instinctive aggression toward anyone who came near during the vulnerable hours of darkness when their programming no longer constrained them to the stage. For Jeremy's spirit inside Bonnie, this meant wandering the halls each night, searching, always searching, driven by impulses he couldn't name toward goals he couldn't define. The guitar he held during the day became an empty prop at night, sometimes left behind in rooms he passed through as if the instrument meant nothing compared to the hunt. His movements, his patterns, his relentless approach toward the security office, all of it stemmed from a child's trauma given supernatural weight, a tragedy that refused to fade into memory because the victim literally could not move on. The original Bonnie, then, represented something far more complex than a simple monster in a horror game. He was a victim, a murdered child, lashing out in the only way available to him. He was a warning about the darkness that could lurk behind cheerful facades, about how places meant for innocence could become stages for unspeakable acts. He was the proof that in the Five Nights at Freddy's universe, death didn't always offer escape, that sometimes the worst fate was to remain trapped and confused, forced to exist in a state between life and death with no understanding of why. As players progressed through the week in the first game, from Monday to Sunday, Bonnie became progressively more aggressive. His AI difficulty increased with each passing night, making him faster, more persistent, harder to avoid. By night 5, he could appear at your door mere minutes after you started your shift, giving you almost no time to prepare or establish a rhythm. By night 6, and the custom nights that followed, Bonnie, at maximum difficulty, became one of the most challenging obstacles in the game, requiring perfect timing and camera management to survive. Yet even at his most aggressive, even when causing yet another jump scare and forcing yet another restart, Bonnie maintained a strange sort of dignity. He wasn't a mindless beast. His movements had purpose, his path had logic, even if that logic came from a place of confused suffering rather than cold programming. When you saw him on the cameras, standing in the backstage or waiting in the supply closet, there was something almost sad about his stillness, about the way he just stood there as if waiting for something he couldn't remember, something that would never come. This combination of terror and tragedy became a hallmark of the Five Nights at Freddy's franchise, but it started with Bonnie, the blue rabbit with his red bow tie and his guitar, stalking the left hallway, appearing at your door, became the template for how the series would handle its horror. Not just jump scares, though those certainly landed with brutal effectiveness. Not just atmospheric tension, though the games excelled at creating dread through sound design and visual ambiguity. The real horror came from understanding that these monsters were victims, that their attacks came from pain, that there were no true villains on the game board, except for the human being who had created this situation decades ago and the player who had to survive the consequences. Bonnie's design also introduced visual elements that would become series staples. The segmented ears that could bend at multiple points, the bow tie, the cartoonish proportions that somehow enhanced rather than diminished the fear, the way fabric suits concealed mechanical endoskeletons beneath. All of this started with Bonnie and would be iterated on in countless variations throughout the franchise. Every Bonnie variant that followed, and there would be many, traced its lineage back to this original design, this perfect storm of friendly appearance and hostile behavior. The community response to Bonnie was immediate and intense. Players shared stories of their first encounters with him, the way he'd caught them off guard, the jump scares that made them physically leap from their chairs. Fan art proliferated, some capturing his menacing presence, others trying to find the child within the machine, depicting Jeremy's spirit as a small figure surrounded by the larger animatronic shell. Theories sprouted about why Bonnie moved the way he did, what his relationship with the other animatronics might be, whether the spirits inside could communicate with each other or were trapped in isolated nightmares. Some fans noted that Bonnie seemed to be Freddy's closest companion, based on their positioning on stage and various pieces of promotional material. This relationship would be explored more deeply in later games, particularly with the glam rock iterations. But even in the first game, there was something about the way Bonnie stood next to Freddy, the way they shared the stage, that suggested a bond beyond simple programming. Whether this reflected the relationship between the children whose spirits possessed them or was purely aesthetic choice remained unclear. But it added depth to characters that could have been simple monsters. The original Bonnie story within the game's timeline extended beyond the gameplay itself. The newspaper clippings and rare screens that players could encounter told of the pizzeria's impending closure due to health code violations and a foul odor coming from the animatronics. That odor, players would come to understand, resulted from the decomposing bodies hidden inside the animatronic shells. By the end of the first game's week, which takes place in November 1993, based on the paycheck visible at game's end, the location would shut down permanently, condemned to rot alongside its dark history. Bonnie and the others would be dismantled, their endoskeletons removed. In what the game presents as a good ending, accessible through specific gameplay conditions, the spirits appear to find some measure of peace, shown through a scene where children's faces appear on screen and then fade away, suggesting they've moved on from their trapped existence. But that wasn't the end of Bonnie's story. Far from it. The first game was set in 1993, but the franchise would reveal that Bonnie had a much longer history, stretching back through different locations, different iterations, different tragedies. The Blue Rabbit on the show stage was just one chapter in a much longer book, and that book's pages were soaked in shadow and sorrow. As we leave the original Bonnie behind and move forward through the timeline, remember what made him special. Remember that first jump scare, that first moment when his face filled your screen and your heart hammered against your ribs. Remember the tension of watching him creep closer on the camera feeds, the dread when the West Hall corner showed empty, the relief when you managed to shut the door just in time. Remember that behind the monster stood a child, behind the terror stood tragedy, and behind the simple mechanics of an indie horror game stood a character who would become iconic, not despite his simplicity, but because of it. Bonnie proved that you didn't need complex graphics or elaborate backstory to create lasting horror. You needed atmosphere, you needed mechanics that created tension, and you needed just enough mystery to let players' imaginations fill in the terrible details. The original Bonnie accomplished all of this and more, setting the standard not just for his own future iterations, but for the entire franchise that would grow from those humble, horrifying beginnings in a darkened pizzeria where a blue rabbit waited in the left hallway, always watching, always coming closer, always ready to remind you that in this world, the night never truly ends. Withered Bonnie, a testament to decay. If the original Bonnie represented fear in its most effective form, then Withered Bonnie embodied something even more disturbing, the physical manifestation of abandonment, decay, and the passage of time in a world where death refused to release its grip. When Five Nights at Freddy's 2 introduced players to the withered animatronics, Bonnie's new appearance shocked even veterans of the first game. This wasn't just a damaged version of the cheerful guitarist from before. This was something that looked like it had crawled out of a nightmare, something that time and neglect had transformed into an object of pure horror. Withered Bonnie's appearance was devastating in its completeness. His entire face had been removed, not just damaged or worn away, but completely stripped from his endoskeleton frame, revealing a dark, gaping cavity where features should have been. Inside that void, dangling wires hung like grotesque tendrils, swaying slightly with his movements, as if alive in their own right. Deep within the darkness of his absent face, his endoskeleton head could barely be seen. A skull-like structure of metal and mechanisms with glowing red irises where eyes should have been, watching from the depths like something ancient and wrong. His lower jaw remained, the only piece of his original face still intact, and it functioned perfectly in his jump-scare animations, opening wide to reveal more teeth than the original Bonnie ever had. These teeth weren't the cute, cartoonish shapes of his previous iteration. They were numerous, sharp, and irregular, giving his jaw the appearance of something organic and predatory, rather than mechanical and safe. The fact that his jaw could still move despite the complete absence of his upper face made him somehow more unsettling, as if the machinery had decided to keep going regardless of its broken state, purpose overriding physical integrity. Withered Bonnie's entire left arm was missing, torn away or removed at some point during the decades between his active service and the present. Only a small strip of fabric remained at the shoulder joint, the rest replaced by a mass of exposed wires that sprouted from the stump like electronic nerves, seeking something to reconnect to. This asymmetry made his silhouette immediately recognizable even in the darkened corners of the Five Nights at Freddy's 2 location. You could identify him from a distance by that missing arm, by the way he moved with that imbalance, listing slightly to one side as his remaining arm hung at his side. The covering on his right hand had come away, revealing the endoskeleton fingers beneath, mechanical digits that clicked and flexed with an unsettling precision. His left foot suffered similar damage. The fabric suit torn away to show the metal framework underneath. Both kneecaps were completely missing, exposing the joint mechanisms that allowed his legs to bend, grinding metal against metal with movements that suggested years without maintenance or care. Throughout his body, smaller tears and rips exposed the endoskeleton beneath, as if the fabric had rotted away in patches, unable to maintain its integrity after so long in storage. Withered Bonnie's overall color scheme had shifted as well. The vibrant blue-purple of the original had faded to a darker, dirtier shade, the kind of color that came from years in a damp storage room without exposure to light. His remaining fabric looked dingy and worn, stained with substances that players could only guess at. The lavender accents of his muzzle and stomach, which survived in fragmentary patches where fabric remained, had yellowed with age, losing any trace of the cheerful appearance they once held. Even his red bow tie, still present around his neck, looked faded and sad, a reminder of what he used to be contrasted sharply against what he had become. What made Withered Bonnie even more disturbing was understanding his place in the franchise's timeline. Five Nights at Freddy's 2, despite being the second game released, was actually a prequel, taking place in 1987, 6 years before the events of the first game. This meant that Withered Bonnie represented the original animatronic from Freddy Fazbear's first location, the one that had performed in the earliest pizzeria before being damaged and decommissioned. The bright, relatively intact Bonnie from the first game was actually a refurbished version of this broken wreck, rebuilt and repaired for the 1993 location. This timeline revelation added layers of tragedy to withered Bonnie's appearance. When Fazbear Entertainment opened a new location in 1987, they attempted to retrofit the old animatronics, to repair them and bring them back into service. But the process had been abandoned, whether due to the extent of the damage or other factors, leaving the withered animatronics in various states of disrepair in the parts and service room. Bonnie, who had already been possessed by Jeremy's spirit for years at this point, spent those years trapped in a body that was systematically falling apart, unable to perform, unable to move freely, locked in darkness and decay. The parts and service room where withered Bonnie started each night in FNAF 2 was a cramped, unsettling space filled with spare heads, endoskeleton parts, and the other withered animatronics in similar states of disrepair. Withered Bonnie sat there alongside withered Freddy, withered Chica, and withered Foxy, all of them damaged in different ways, all of them seemingly dormant until the cameras looked away. When midnight struck and the shift began, withered Bonnie would activate, rising from his slumped position to begin his journey through the new location. His movement patterns in FNAF 2 followed a fixed path unlike the more random navigation of the first game. Withered Bonnie would leave parts and service and head to the main hall, a large open area where the new toy animatronics performed during the day. From there, he'd move to the hallway right outside the office, a narrow corridor where he'd stand and stare directly at the night guard through the camera, his faceless head tilted in a way that suggested curiosity or perhaps malicious intent. Then came Party Room 1, and from there he'd climb into the left air vent, using the building's ventilation system to bypass the hallways entirely and emerge directly in the office. This ability to use the vents made withered Bonnie incredibly dangerous. The vent system in FNAF 2 represented a vulnerability that couldn't be blocked with simple doors. Your only defense when animatronics entered through the vents was the Freddy Fazbear mask, a hollow head that you'd wear to disguise yourself as one of them. The mask mechanic added a new dimension to the gameplay, forcing you to sit there immobile while withered Bonnie and others invaded your space, hoping they'd be fooled by the disguise and leave rather than attacking. When withered Bonnie appeared in the office, his missing face took on new horror. He'd lean in close, that dark void where his features should have been filling your view, the dangling wires almost close enough to touch, the glowing red eyes in his endoskeleton skull piercing through the darkness with an intelligence that mechanical lights shouldn't possess. You had to remain perfectly still, had to trust in the mask's deception, had to hope that whatever drove this broken animatronic would be satisfied and move on. The tension of those moments, waiting while he examined you, wondering if this time the mask would fail, created some of the most intense experiences in the entire game. Withered Bonnie was notably more active than most other animatronics in FNAF 2. He could leave parts and service as early as midnight on the first night, almost immediately beginning his hunt. On later nights with higher difficulty, he could appear in the office multiple times per hour, requiring constant vigilance and frequent use of the mask. This aggressive behavior made him one of the primary threats in the game, alongside withered Foxy and the puppet, characters whose persistence forced players to adapt their strategies constantly. The lore implications of withered Bonnie's state raised disturbing questions. How did he lose his face? The damage was too extensive, too clean to be simple wear and tear. It looked deliberate, as if someone had removed his facial features on purpose, perhaps to scavenge parts for the new toy animatronics, or perhaps for darker reasons that the games only hinted at. The missing arm suggested similar deliberate removal, rather than accidental damage. These animatronics hadn't just broken down. They'd been cannibalized, stripped for parts, and left to rot. Jeremy's spirit inside this broken shell must have experienced a particular form of horror. Imagine being trapped in a body that was already a prison, and then having that body systematically dismantled while you remained conscious, aware, unable to escape. The possession that bound him to Bonnie meant he felt every removal, every piece torn away, every moment of the decay. And still, he couldn't leave, couldn't pass on, locked into the machinery even as the machinery fell apart around him. The timeline also revealed that withered Bonnie was the very same animatronic that William Afton had used to lure and murder the children. Though Afton had worn a yellow spring Bonnie suit for those crimes, rather than possessing this blue model. Still, withered Bonnie had been present in the restaurant during the missing children incident, had perhaps even stood on stage performing while children disappeared into back rooms, oblivious to the horror unfolding behind the scenes. When Jeremy's body was stuffed into a Bonnie suit, it was this one, very much like it, making the animatronic both victim and crime scene, both memorial and prison. Gameplay-wise, withered Bonnie's jump scare remained one of the series' most effective. Unlike the original game's static burst, FNAF 2's jump scares featured full animations. When withered Bonnie attacked, he'd lunge forward from the left vent, that faceless head jerking toward the camera as his mechanical scream filled your ears. The animation emphasized his asymmetry, his missing arm creating an off-balance lurch that made his movement seem wrong, even beyond the expected wrongness of a possessed animatronic. His remaining hand would reach out as if trying to grab you, those exposed endoskeleton fingers flexing with mechanical precision that was somehow more threatening than claws. The community's reaction to withered Bonnie was one of fascinated horror. Fan artists struggled to capture his appearance, trying to decide how much detail to include in that gaping facial void, whether to emphasize the hanging wires or the barely visible endoskeleton beneath. Cosplayers took on the challenge of recreating his design, building elaborate costumes that captured his deteriorated state. Theorists debated what the extensive damage meant for the lore, how it connected to the broader timeline, whether his condition was unique or if all the withered animatronics had suffered similar deliberate dismantling. Some fans noted the irony that withered Bonnie, the most damaged animatronic aesthetically, was also one of the most aggressive and threatening gameplay-wise. His broken state didn't make him weaker or easier to avoid. If anything, it seemed to fuel his hunting behavior, as if the damage had stripped away whatever restraint remained in his programming or in Jeremy's confused spirit. He was pure threat, pure aggression, a horror that had been reduced to its most basic components through years of neglect and abuse. Withered Bonnie also appeared in the FNAF 2 minigames, the 8-bit sequences that revealed story details between nights. In these simplified graphics, his design was represented as a basic blue shape, but his role in the narrative became clearer. The Save Them minigame showed him navigating the pizzeria, discovering the bodies of new victims scattered throughout the location, evidence that the killer had struck again. These minigames revealed that the 1987 location suffered its own murders, separate from but connected to the original missing children incident, expanding the tragedy beyond what players initially understood. The fate of withered Bonnie after FNAF 2's events was documented through phone calls and later games. After the location closed due to the bite of 87 and other unfortunate incidents, the withered animatronics were kept in storage. Eventually, Fazbear Entertainment decided to refurbish them for a new location, the one depicted in the first game. This meant withered Bonnie would be repaired, given a new face, a new arm, new coverings over his endoskeleton. He'd become the classic Bonnie that players encountered in FNAF 1, his damage hidden beneath fresh fabric and paint, his horror concealed behind a facade of friendly entertainment once again. This knowledge that withered Bonnie would become the classic Bonnie created a strange temporal loop in players' understanding. When you died to Bonnie in FNAF 1, you were being killed by this same broken animatronic, just cleaned up and put back on stage. The spirit remained the same. The endoskeleton beneath remained the same, only the surface had changed. It made every encounter with the classic Bonnie somehow sadder, knowing what he'd been through, knowing the decay that lurked just beneath the newer coverings. Withered Bonnie's design influenced later animatronics in the series. The concept of exposed endoskeletons, of damage that revealed the machinery beneath the friendly exterior, became a series staple. Characters like Mangle took the concept even further, but withered Bonnie pioneered the aesthetic of broken beauty, of horror that came from seeing what was never meant to be visible. His missing face especially became iconic, referenced and reimagined in various ways throughout subsequent games and fan works. In Help Wanted's VR recreation of FNAF 2, withered Bonnie received a visual upgrade while maintaining his horrifying essence. The VR format allowed players to see him in 3 dimensions, to appreciate the depth of that facial void, to look down into the darkness where his face should have been, and see the mechanical skull buried deep within. The immersive nature of VR made his office invasions even more intense, as you'd see him approaching from the vent in full stereoscopic vision, that faceless horror emerging into your space with nowhere to hide except behind the mask. The Curse of Dreadbear DLC for Help Wanted featured withered Bonnie prominently in its trick-or-treat minigame. Players would answer a door to find various animatronics, and if withered Bonnie appeared, you had to quickly don the correct mask to avoid his attack. This minigame emphasized his instant recognizability. Even in poor lighting, even partially obscured, that missing face made him immediately identifiable. No other character in the franchise had quite the same silhouette, quite the same presence. Withered Bonnie represented a turning point in the franchise's approach to horror. Where the first game had relied on implication and shadow, FNAF 2 brought the damage into full view. It said, "Look at what time and neglect do. Look at what happens when tragedy isn't dealt with, when victims are left to rot, when entertainment corporations prioritize profit over proper care or remembrance." Withered Bonnie was a walking indictment of Fazbear Entertainment's practices, a physical manifestation of corporate negligence and its consequences. For Jeremy Spirit, the time as withered Bonnie must have been the darkest period of his trapped existence. At least during his time as classic Bonnie, he could perform, could move freely, could fulfill some aspect of what the animatronic was designed to do. But as withered Bonnie, he sat in darkness and decay, surrounded by other broken animatronics in similar states of despair, animated only by the need to hunt at night, to attack, to continue a cycle of violence that served no purpose and brought no relief. It was purgatory in mechanical form, suffering without end or meaning. The 2 buttons visible on withered Bonnie's chest, barely noticeable among all the damage, were curious details that carried over from withered Freddy. These buttons suggested an earlier design philosophy, some element of the animatronic's original construction that had been abandoned in later models. They served as little archaeological markers, hints that these machines had a history before their current state, that they'd been built with care and attention to detail before being allowed to fall into such disrepair. The fact that the buttons remained while so much else had been stripped away made them somehow poignant, like flowers growing in a battlefield. As we move forward in our exploration of Bonnie's many forms, keep withered Bonnie in mind. Remember that horror doesn't always come from monsters, but from seeing familiar things broken beyond recognition, yet still moving, still functioning, still hunting. Remember that decay is its own kind of terror, that abandonment can be worse than destruction. And remember that behind this faceless horror stood the same child who'd possessed the original Bonnie, the same Jeremy who'd been murdered and trapped, now suffering through another layer of torment in a body that matched the state of his spirit, broken, incomplete, screaming silently into a void that never answered back. Spring Bonnie, the golden deception, before the blue Bonnie became an icon of horror, before withered Bonnie showed what decay could do to metal and fabric, there existed another rabbit in the dark history of Fazbear Entertainment. This rabbit wore yellow instead of blue, gold instead of purple, and stood at the very beginning of everything terrible that would follow. This was Spring Bonnie, the golden rabbit who danced alongside Fredbear at the original Fredbear's Family Diner. The character who would become both weapon and tomb for the franchise's greatest villain. Spring Bonnie represented innovation in animatronic technology, a marvel of engineering that could function in 2 distinct modes. During performances, Spring Bonnie operated as a standard animatronic, powered by internal motors and servos, moving through programmed routines to entertain children, while Fredbear, a golden bear, stood beside him on stage. But Spring Bonnie had a special feature that made him unique: spring-lock technology. Through a series of compressed springs and locks positioned throughout the suit's interior, the animatronic components could be wound back and secured in place, creating empty space inside the costume. This transformation allowed a human performer to wear Spring Bonnie like a suit, bringing the character to life through their own movements while maintaining the character's appearance. The spring-lock suits represented the height of 1970s animatronic design, a way to combine the spectacle of moving mascot characters with the personal touch of human performers. An employee could climb inside Spring Bonnie, wind the locks into position to keep the robotic components secured, and then walk among the guests, interact with children, and create magical memories in a way that stationary animatronics couldn't match. It was brilliant from an entertainment standpoint. Fredbear's Family Diner used both Spring Bonnie and a similar Fredbear suit to maximum effect, creating experiences that set them apart from other children's entertainment venues. But the spring-lock technology carried inherent deadly risks. The locks that held the animatronic components in place were sensitive to moisture and sudden movements. Even a small amount of sweat or a sharp motion could cause the locks to fail, allowing the compressed springs to snap back into their default position with tremendous force. When that happened with a person inside the suit, the result was catastrophic. Metal rods, gears, and mechanical components would drive into flesh, impaling the wearer in dozens of places simultaneously, crushing organs, puncturing lungs, causing internal bleeding that would lead to a slow, agonizing death. Phone Guy's training tapes in FNAF 3 detailed these risks with unsettling calmness, describing spring lock failures as something that could happen if employees weren't careful. The tapes instructed performers to wind the locks tightly, to avoid moisture at all costs, to move slowly and deliberately, to treat the suit with the respect that a potentially lethal piece of machinery demanded. But even with precautions, multiple spring lock failures occurred at various Fazbear locations over the years, incidents that were severe enough to lead to the suits being decommissioned entirely and sealed away in safe rooms where they wouldn't pose further threat to employees. Spring Bonnie, when operational and safely animated or worn, had a design that was both cheerful and slightly unsettling. The suit was a bright, vibrant yellow, the color of sunshine or gold coins, meant to seem friendly and approachable. His face featured large, expressive eyes with visible whites and black pupils, a squarish muzzle similar to the later Bonnie designs, and a wide, fixed grin that stretched across his face. The grin looked pleasant in good lighting, but took on a more sinister cast in shadows, as fixed smiles always do. He wore a purple bow tie, and sometimes a purple vest in certain depictions, adding splashes of colour to the golden suit. The character's role at Fredbear's family diner was to be Fredbear's companion, the secondary mascot, who brought energy and fun to balance Fredbear's more reserved presence. Together they performed songs, greeted families, and created the foundation for what would eventually become Freddy Fazbear's Pizza and the entire Fazbear Entertainment empire. Spring Bonnie represented the innocent beginnings of the franchise, the moment before everything went dark, the golden age that the name implied. But Spring Bonnie's greatest significance wasn't in his role as an entertainer. It was in how William Afton, co-founder of Fazbear Entertainment and secret serial killer, used the suit as a tool for murder. Afton discovered that children trusted Spring Bonnie implicitly. The bright yellow rabbit, either animated or worn by a performer, registered as safe and friendly in young minds. Kids would follow Spring Bonnie without question, believing they were being led to games, prizes, or special surprises. This trust made Spring Bonnie the perfect lure for Afton's terrible purposes. The Fruity Maze minigame in Pizzeria Simulator showed this dynamic explicitly. A young girl named Susie, one of Afton's victims, encountered Spring Bonnie near the pizzeria. The golden rabbit told her that her dog was still alive, that if she followed him, he could show her where her pet was waiting. Susie, grief-stricken and desperate, believed this promise. She followed Spring Bonnie into a back room, away from the public areas, away from safety. What happened next was never shown directly, but the implication was clear and horrible. Afton, wearing the Spring Bonnie suit, murdered Susie and would later stuff her body into an animatronic, where her spirit would become trapped just like the others. This wasn't an isolated incident. The missing children incident, which saw 5 children disappear from a Freddy Fazbear's Pizza location in the mid-1980s, involved Afton using a mascot suit to lure his victims to the safe room. While sources differ on whether he used Spring Bonnie or a different suit for all the murders, Spring Bonnie appears to have been his preferred disguise, the face of innocence he wore while committing unspeakable acts. The safe room where he took his victims was specifically designed to be invisible to the animatronics programming, not showing up on their navigation systems, hidden from security cameras, a dead zone in the building where anything could happen without record or witness. The safe rooms themselves became important to Spring Bonnie's story. These spaces existed in various Freddy's locations, originally designed as a place to store the Springlock suits and as an employee refuge if animatronics malfunctioned during the day. But they also served as perfect killing grounds for Afton. After using Spring Bonnie to lure children away from the public areas, he'd take them to the safe room where soundproofing and isolation ensured no one would hear screams or discover evidence until it was far too late. The rooms became tombs, spaces where innocents went to die. After the Springlock failures and the associated lawsuits and investigations, Fazbear Entertainment declared the Springlock suits temporarily unfit for use and ordered all locations to seal their safe rooms. This meant bricking up the entrances, removing them from building schematics, and forbidding employees from accessing them. The suits inside, including Spring Bonnie, were to be left indefinitely, forgotten remnants of a technology that had proven too dangerous to continue using. But this sealing created a problem. It left the suits in place, gathering dust in abandoned rooms, waiting for someone to rediscover them. Spring Bonnie sat in a sealed safe room for years, possibly decades, his golden fabric fading to a dirtier greenish-yellow hue, his components rusting in the dampness of poor ventilation, his presence forgotten by everyone except the person who'd used him for evil and the spirits of his victims who remembered everything. The suit waited in darkness, as patient as only inanimate objects can be, not knowing that his story was far from over, that he would become important again in ways more horrible than his original purpose. The minigames scattered throughout FNAF 3 showed Spring Bonnie in various contexts, always in that simplified 8-bit art style but recognizable by his color and rabbit design. In the Stage Era 1 minigame, Spring Bonnie performed alongside Fredbear at what was presumably Fredbear's family diner, showing the innocent origins of these characters. In the Night 4 minigame of FNAF 4, a Spring Bonnie head appeared in the spare parts room, though this one looked more rabbit-like than the costume version, suggesting different Spring Bonnie suits existed for different purposes. What made Spring Bonnie particularly tragic was understanding that the character itself was innocent. Spring Bonnie, as a concept, as an entertainer meant to bring joy to children, had done nothing wrong. The designers who created him, the engineers who built the Springlock technology, even the performers who wore the suit during its legitimate use, they'd all intended something positive. Spring Bonnie should have been a beloved character from a successful franchise, a mascot that people remembered fondly from childhood visits to Fredbear's. Instead, Afton corrupted that innocence, turned it into a weapon, made Spring Bonnie's friendly appearance into a tool for evil. The character's golden color had probably been chosen because gold seemed special, magical, something that would draw children's attention and make them feel like they were experiencing something unique. Gold meant prizes, treasure, something valuable and rare. Spring Bonnie in his prime would have been striking. A bright figure on stage or moving through crowds, impossible to miss and designed to delight. Every aspect of his design said, "Trust me, come closer, I'm here to make you happy." And Afton twisted all of that into its opposite, using exactly those qualities to hurt the vulnerable children who believed what Spring Bonnie represented. There were hints throughout the games that Spring Bonnie had been decommissioned after the Bite of 83, the incident where Fredbear's jaws crushed a child's head during a birthday party. If Spring Bonnie used similar Springlock technology to Fredbear, then the decision to retire both suits made sense from a liability standpoint. The company couldn't risk another catastrophic failure, couldn't afford another lawsuit or more bad publicity, so Spring Bonnie went into storage, first at Fredbear's, and then transferred to the various Freddy's locations as the company expanded, eventually ending up sealed in a safe room and forgotten. Except William Afton never forgot. He knew where the Spring Bonnie suit was because he'd used it, had worn it during his crimes, and years later, when the spirits of his victims finally caught up with him, when they cornered him in the old, abandoned pizzeria and demanded the justice they'd been denied in life, Afton would return to that safe room. He'd see Spring Bonnie hanging on the wall or slumped in a corner, and in a moment of desperate panic, he'd make a terrible decision that would transform both himself and the suit into something far worse than either had been separately. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before Spring Bonnie became Springtrap, before Afton climbed inside and sealed his fate, the Golden Rabbit existed in a liminal state, neither entirely forgotten nor remembered, not destroyed but not functional, caught between past and future in a sealed room that time had forgotten. The character represented a fork in the road where Fazbear Entertainment's history had diverged from light into darkness, where innovation had led to disaster, where something meant for joy had been corrupted into an instrument of evil. The few employees who remembered Spring Bonnie probably thought of him with a mixture of nostalgia and unease. Old-timers who'd worked at Fredbear's might have fond memories of performing in the suite or watching others do so, remembering the magic they'd created for children before understanding what horrors had occurred behind the scenes. Later employees, those who knew only rumors and whispered stories about why the Springlock suits had been discontinued, might have felt relief that such dangerous technology had been abandoned, grateful they'd never have to risk wearing something that could kill them so horribly. Phone Guy's training tapes offered the clearest window into how Spring Bonnie and Fredbear had been viewed by management. The tape spoke about the suits with a strange mixture of pride in the technology and concern about its risks, like a parent discussing a brilliant but troubled child. The Springlock mechanism was clearly a source of engineering pride, something that Fazbear Entertainment had developed and which gave them an edge over competitors. But the liability issues, the failures, the incidents, these were discussed in that same calm corporate voice that tried to minimize concerns while still covering legal requirements by acknowledging risks. In some ways, Spring Bonnie was more tragic than any of the possessed animatronics. Bonnie, Freddy, Chica, Foxy, they'd been victims too, but they'd never had agency in their crimes. They were vessels for confused, traumatized spirits lashing out in pain and confusion. Spring Bonnie had been an active participant in evil, had been used deliberately by someone who understood exactly what they were doing. The suit had been complicit, not through any will of its own, but through its very design, its friendly appearance, its ability to hide a human being inside while presenting a trustworthy face to the world. This complicity without agency created a unique horror in Spring Bonnie's existence. Every child who trusted the Golden Rabbit, who'd followed because they believed in the character's kindness, had been betrayed not just by Afton, but by everything the costume represented. Their faith in friendly mascots, their trust in adult authority figures in costume, their belief that places like Freddy's were safe, all of it had been shattered by Spring Bonnie's role in their deaths. And the suit itself couldn't object, couldn't refuse to be used in such terrible ways, couldn't be anything except what it was. Fabric and metal and mechanisms, neutral in morality, capable of being wielded for good or evil depending on who wore it. The exact number of Spring Bonnie suits that existed remained unclear across the games. Evidence suggested multiple versions, perhaps one at Fredbear's and others at various Freddy's locations, maybe different iterations designed for different purposes or to replace worn-out versions. The head in the FNAF 4 spare parts room looked different from the suit Afton wore for murder, suggesting variations in design. This ambiguity created its own uncertainty. How many Spring Bonnies were there? How many had been sealed in safe rooms? Did some remain undiscovered, waiting in abandoned buildings that Fazbear Entertainment had long since closed and forgotten? What we know for certain is that at least one Spring Bonnie suit remained in the safe room of an abandoned Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, and that this suit would become important again in the most terrible way possible. Spring Bonnie's story wasn't over. In fact, the worst was yet to come. The golden rabbit, who'd been retired, sealed away, left to rot in darkness, would soon become the prison and sustenance for a dead man who refused to stay dead, who would merge with the suit in a union of flesh and metal that created one of the franchise's most iconic and horrifying figures. Spring Bonnie represented the beginning, the innocent idea before it was corrupted, the technology before it failed, the tool before it was misused. But beginnings lead to continuations, and Spring Bonnie's continuation would be written in rust, rot, and the undying malice of a killer who chose this golden rabbit as his last refuge from the consequences of his actions. Springtrap, the undying. In the decay of an abandoned Freddy Fazbear's Pizza location, where rain leaked through holes in the roof, and years of neglect had turned cheerful party rooms into mouldering ruins. Something that had once been William Afton, and something that had once been Spring Bonnie, had merged into a nightmare that exceeded the sum of their parts. This was Springtrap, and his creation was born from the most horrific moment in the franchise's timeline. The moment when a killer tried to escape justice and instead found a punishment worse than death. The events that created Springtrap unfolded in a scene that the FNAF 3 minigames showed in 8-bit simplicity, but that simplicity couldn't diminish the horror of what occurred. Years after the missing children incident, after the pizzeria where the murders happened had closed permanently, William Afton returned to the building. His reasons remained ambiguous in the games, but later material suggested he was trying to destroy the haunted animatronics, to dismantle them and extract the remnant infused in their endoskeletons for his own experiments with immortality. Using Shadow Freddy as a lure, a dark apparition that led the animatronics one by one to the sealed safe room, Afton dismantled Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, and Foxy, tearing them apart piece by piece. But destroying their physical forms freed the spirits trapped inside. Gabriel, Jeremy, Susie, Fritz, and Cassidy, the 5 children whose murders had started everything, materialized as ghostly apparitions that appeared to Afton in the safe room where he'd killed them. They closed in on him, their translucent forms showing children who'd been frozen at the moment of their deaths, forever young, forever angry, forever seeking the justice they'd been denied. Afton, confronted with the consequences of his actions, made visible and undeniable, panicked. He spotted the Spring Bonnie suit hanging on the wall or slumped in a corner of the safe room. The same suit he'd worn to lure these children to their deaths, the costume that had made them trust him enough to follow into isolation. In his terror, Afton saw the suit as salvation, as protection, as a way to hide from the spectral children who wanted revenge. He climbed inside, pulling the decrepit costume around himself, fitting his limbs into the spaces designed for animatronic components or human performers, settling the headpiece over his own skull. For a moment, he thought he'd escaped. The children hesitated, perhaps confused by seeing Spring Bonnie again, perhaps uncertain if their killer still hid inside the costume. Afton, still wearing the suit, began to laugh. The sound echoed in the safe room, manic and relieved, the laugh of someone who believed they'd outsmarted death itself. But the safe room was damp. Rain had been seeping through the building's damaged roof for years, pooling on the floor, soaking into everything the sealed room contained. Spring Bonnie's spring lock mechanisms, already degraded from decades of disuse and poor storage conditions, detected the moisture. The locks, designed to hold back tremendous mechanical force, began to fail. One by one, the springs that kept the animatronic components compressed started to loosen, to slip, to give way. The first lock snapped with a sound like a gunshot, and William Afton's laughter turned to screaming. A metal rod drove through his shoulder, punching through fabric and flesh, and emerging out the other side. Then another lock failed, and another, a cascade of mechanical failures that happened too fast to track. Gears crushed his chest, compressing his ribcage. Wire wrapped around his neck like garrots. Rods impaled his arms, his legs, his torso, each one punching through his body with force enough to pin him to the interior of the suit. His lungs punctured, filling with blood. His organs ruptured under the pressure. The metal framework of the suit's head clamped down around his skull, pins driving through his cheeks and jaw, a mechanical vice that wouldn't release. But William Afton didn't die, not immediately. The springlock failure was designed to kill, but not quickly. The impalement caused massive trauma, but avoided immediately fatal injuries to the brain or major arteries in ways that seemed almost calculated. Afton remained conscious, trapped in agony as his body slowly failed, as blood loss and internal injuries brought him closer to death with agonizing slowness. He could feel every point where metal pierced flesh, every place where gears ground against bone, every wire cutting into skin. The spirits of the children watched this happen, whether they caused the springlock failure through supernatural means or simply witnessed it as karmic justice. Delivered by the building's decay remains unclear from the evidence, but they saw William Afton suffer in a way that eclipsed anything they'd experienced. And when his death finally came, after minutes or possibly hours of unimaginable pain, something beyond normal understanding occurred. Afton's spirit, his consciousness, his fundamental self, remained bound to the suit just as the children's spirits had been bound to the animatronics. Based on what we know of his remnant experiments and exposure to supernatural forces through his murders, combined with the sheer malevolent will that had driven him for decades, these factors appear to have conspired to keep him anchored to the physical world, trapped in the very costume he'd used to commit his crimes. The result was Springtrap, a fusion of rotted corpse and decaying animatronic, a being that was neither alive nor truly dead, but something caught between states in violation of natural law. The Spring Bonnie suit that Afton had worn became his prison and his body, the metal and fabric incorporating into his remains in ways that were biological as much as mechanical. Over the 30 years that followed, as Springtrap sat sealed in that safe room with no light and no sound except rain and decay, the fusion became complete. Flesh mummified and merged with fabric. Metal rusted into bone. The boundaries between William Afton and Spring Bonnie dissolved until neither existed separately anymore. when the safe room was finally opened during FNAF 3's timeline, when the crew preparing Fazbear's Fright found Springtrap and brought him to their horror attraction. They had no idea they were transporting an active, conscious being. They saw a badly damaged animatronic, an authentic relic from Freddy's dark history, perfect for their attraction. They didn't understand that Springtrap was aware that William Afton's consciousness persisted inside the rotted shell, that they'd just given a serial killer access to a building full of potential new victims. Springtrap's appearance in FNAF 3 was the stuff of nightmares. The Spring Bonnie suit had decayed to a drab olive-yellow color. All golden brightness faded to the hue of old parchment or diseased skin. Large sections of the fabric had torn or rotted away entirely, revealing the endoskeleton beneath and, more disturbingly, the organic remains incorporated into the structure. You could see a mummified corpse inside Springtrap if you looked closely at certain angles, particularly in rare boot images that showed his head tilted back, mouth open, revealing William Afton's desiccated face behind the animatronic mask. The right side of his head was missing a large chunk, exposing wiring and internal mechanisms. His left ear barely clung to his head, mostly missing with only a wire-filled stump remaining. Throughout his body, holes and tears revealed exposed wiring, support structures, and in some places, what looked like human muscle tissue that had somehow mummified without completely decomposing. His legs were stripped from mid-shin down, showing only the bare endoskeleton feet that clicked and scraped when he walked. Fingers on both hands were missing their fabric coverings, exposing the metal digits beneath. And everywhere you could see rust, decay, water damage. The evidence of 3 decades spent in a damp, sealed room with no maintenance and no escape. But the most disturbing aspect of Springtrap wasn't his appearance. It was his behavior. Unlike the other animatronics in the franchise, Springtrap was controlled by a human consciousness, by William Afton's malevolent intelligence operating through animatronic components. This made him far more dangerous than the confused spirits of children seeking confused revenge. Springtrap hunted with purpose, with strategy, with the cunning of someone who'd successfully evaded justice for decades and who retained all his intelligence despite his deteriorated physical state. In FNAF 3's gameplay, Springtrap would move through the Fazbear's Fright building systematically, checking rooms, navigating hallways, searching for the security guard's office with an intelligence that the camera system could only partially track. Unlike previous animatronics who followed somewhat predictable patterns, Springtrap seemed to think, to plan, to choose his routes based on more than simple programming. He'd hide in dark corners, waiting for the guard to check the wrong camera. He'd circle around, approaching from unexpected directions. He'd even sometimes stare directly at cameras, as if daring the guard to watch, as if Afton's personality was asserting itself through the machine. The only reliable defense against Springtrap involved the building's audio system. Fazbear's Fright had installed devices in various rooms that could play sound effects, including recordings of children's laughter and the balloon boy giggle from FNAF 2. These sounds would attract Springtrap, luring him away from the office and buying the guard time. The fact that children's laughter could distract him added a particularly dark dimension to his character. Even in this state, even as a rotted fusion of flesh and machine, Afton's nature as a child predator persisted. The sounds that attracted him were the same ones that would have preceded his murders when he was alive. The innocent giggles of children who didn't know danger approached. Springtrap also generated the phantom animatronics, ghostly apparitions of burned and melted characters that would appear on cameras and cause system malfunctions. While these phantoms couldn't directly harm the player, their appearances made surviving Springtrap more difficult by disabling audio systems, ventilation, or cameras. The suggestion was that these hallucinations came from Springtrap himself, that Afton's presence was so malevolent it generated supernatural interference, or that the spirits of his victims still clung to him even in this form, trying to slow him down, or perhaps trying to warn the guard of the danger approaching. When Springtrap caught the player, his jump scare showed him lurching from the doorway or vent, his damaged head jerking forward as his mechanical scream mixed with what might have been a human voice beneath the static. The jump scare was different from the purely mechanical screams of other animatronics, had a layer to it that suggested consciousness, intention, a being that understood what it was doing and took satisfaction in the kill. This wasn't a confused spirit acting on instinct. This was murder, deliberate and malicious, carried out by someone who'd done it before and would do it again given the chance. The FNAF 3 good ending showed something surprising about Springtrap. After the horror attraction burned down, after the building was destroyed in a fire that might have been accidental, or might have been intentionally set to cleanse the location, the newspaper article brightened to reveal Springtrap's head in shadow. He'd survived. The fire that should have destroyed him, that would have killed any normal animatronic or any human being, hadn't been enough to stop him. William Afton's determination to persist, to refuse death, to continue existing out of sheer malevolent will, kept Springtrap functional even after flames consumed Fazbear's Fright. This survival raised disturbing questions. If Springtrap could survive being sealed in a room for 30 years and then survive a building fire, what could stop him? The fusion of human spirit and animatronic components had created something that seemed almost indestructible, something that would persist no matter how much damage accumulated, no matter how many times circumstances should have ended his existence. Afton's quest for immortality, conducted through his experiments with remnant and possession, had succeeded in the most horrible way possible. He wouldn't die. He couldn't die. He was condemned to existence in this rotted, painful form forever, or at least until someone found a way to finally destroy him. The law implications of Springtrap extended beyond his physical form. His existence proved several things about the FNAF universe's rules. First, human spirits could possess animatronics, or at least mechanical objects, not just children, but adults as well. Second, the possession could be resilient enough to survive extreme damage, fire, and time. Third, consciousness persisted in these possessions, meaning Springtrap wasn't just animated, he was aware, capable of thought, experiencing every moment of his existence in this deteriorated state. This last point deserved emphasis. William Afton's consciousness inside Springtrap suggested he experienced his situation with some level of awareness. Evidence from his later behaviors and dialogue implies he knew he was trapped in a rotting suit filled with his own mummified remains. The nature of spirit possession in this universe suggests he felt sensations through the mechanical shell, possibly including the metal inside him, the decay of the fabric, the grinding of mechanisms that had partially merged with what remained of his physical form. And based on his persistent returns throughout the franchise, he appeared unable to escape it, unable to remove the suit that had become part of him, unable to die again, despite existing in what seemed like a form of torment. The community's reaction to Springtrap was immediate and intense. Here was William Afton finally made visible, the purple guy from the minigames given physical form as the rotted nightmare he deserved to be. Fans created artwork showing Springtrap in various stages of decay, emphasizing either the Spring Bonnie suit or the corpse within, exploring the horror of his condition. Cosplayers took on the monumental challenge of recreating his appearance, building suits that captured his deteriorated state with impressive accuracy. Theorists debated whether Springtrap could be saved, if some way existed to free Afton's spirit, or if he was damned to this existence forever. Some fans noted the poetic justice in Springtrap's creation. Afton had used Spring Bonnie to lure and kill children. Now Spring Bonnie had become his eternal prison. The suit that gave him power over his victims became the instrument of his downfall. The Springlock technology that he'd helped develop, or at least used extensively, had betrayed him at the moment he needed it most. Even the safe room where he'd killed so many became the site of his own terrible transformation. Every element of his crimes came back to trap him, to punish him, to ensure his suffering matched what he'd inflicted. Others pointed out that Springtrap represented the franchise's central theme made physical. Five Nights at Freddy's had always been about consequences, about how evil doesn't just disappear but persists, about how trauma leaves marks that time cannot erase. Springtrap was consequences incarnate, literally unable to move past his crimes because they'd merged with his physical being. The children's spirits might eventually find peace, might be freed through the various good endings, but Afton couldn't be freed from Springtrap because Afton and Springtrap were the same thing now. His punishment was to become what he'd used to hurt others, to wear his sins as a literal second skin that would never come off. The design of Springtrap also influenced how later games portrayed villains. The concept of a deteriorated fusion character that combined organic and mechanical elements became a template. Scraptrap would follow in Pizzeria Simulator, and while debates continued about whether that was the same Springtrap in a different suit or a different entity entirely, the basic concept remained: decay as horror, fusion as nightmare, consciousness trapped in a deteriorating form. Springtrap appeared in later games as well, not always as the actual character, but as recreations in the Freddy Fazbear virtual experience. Help Wanted featured Springtrap prominently, allowing VR players to experience his hunt in 3 dimensions. The immersion of VR made him even more terrifying, as you'd see him approaching through vents or corridors with stereoscopic depth. His decayed form given new life through higher resolution graphics. His presence in the VR game was framed as Fazbear entertainment, using rumors about their history, incorporating Springtrap as entertainment, despite the horrific truth behind his creation. Springtrap's role in the broader timeline created complexity. After surviving the Fazbear's fright fire, he apparently wandered for years, possibly searching for something, possibly just existing without purpose. Later, lore suggested he eventually found his way to the pizzeria trap in Pizzeria Simulator, drawn by Henry Emily's plan to gather all the haunted animatronics and destroy them once and for all. But even that wouldn't be the end of Springtrap's influence, as elements of his digital consciousness would later manifest in other forms, ensuring that William Afton's evil persisted even after his physical destruction. What made Springtrap particularly effective as a horror element was the marriage of tragic backstory with present threat. Yes, his creation involved suffering that we could intellectually recognize as terrible. Springlock failure was agonizing. Being trapped in a decaying suit for 30 years was torture. But Springtrap wasn't a sympathetic victim. He was a monster, who'd earned his fate through his own terrible choices. The horror came from understanding that he suffered and that he deserved that suffering, that this was justice even though it looked like torture, that sometimes the villain's punishment had to be as extreme as his crimes. Springtrap also represented the corruption of childhood innocence made literal. Spring Bonnie had been designed to bring joy to children, to be a friendly face at birthday parties, to represent the magic of entertainment. Afton corrupted that purpose, used it for evil, and now wore the corruption as a permanent shell. The friendly rabbit mask still grinned in its fixed expression, even as the reality beneath it rotted and decayed. Parents who brought their children to Freddy's expected magic and wonder. What they got, what lived in Springtrap, was the opposite of everything Spring Bonnie was supposed to be. As we move forward through the timeline to examine what came after Springtrap, remember what he represented. This was evil that refused to die. Malevolence so strong it overcame death itself. A killer so determined to persist that he survived in a state worse than death for decades. Springtrap was proof that in the Five Nights at Freddy's universe, some sins were too great to be washed away, some people too wicked to deserve peace, and some forms of justice required suffering that exceeded human capacity to inflict. The Golden Rabbit, who once stood beside Fredbear in innocent partnership, had become a warning. Those who corrupt innocence for evil purposes will find that innocence becomes their prison, and that prison will hold for all eternity. Scraptrap and the final curtain. 30 years trapped in the Spring Bonnie suit, surviving a building fire, and continuing to wander as Springtrap should have been punishment enough for any being, human or otherwise. But William Afton's story didn't end with his escape from Fazbear's fright. At some point after those flames consumed the horror attraction, Afton made a decision that showcased either his determination to continue his existence or his inability to accept the state he'd been reduced to. He abandoned the original Springtrap form and transferred his consciousness, his possession, his spirit, into a different Spring Bonnie suit. This new form, known as Scraptrap, or sometimes referred to as Afton, appeared in Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator with a design that sparked considerable debate among fans, while clearly still a deteriorated Spring Bonnie suit containing William Afton's remains. Scraptrap looked distinct from Springtrap in ways that raised questions about how such a transfer was possible or why it occurred. The most common interpretation suggests he somehow moved between suits, though the exact mechanics remain unclear. This ambiguity likely stems from the intersection of remnant properties, spirit possession mechanics, and possibly Afton's attempts to escape the advanced decay of his original prison. Scraptrap's appearance showed a Spring Bonnie suit in even worse condition than Springtrap had been. The fabric was a dirty, bone-like color, somewhere between white and brown. All yellow pigment completely faded, or perhaps this suit had never been the bright gold of the original. His right arm was intact, but his left ended at the forearm in a mass of exposed wiring. His skull was partially visible, the animatronic head having degraded to the point where Afton's actual skull showed through, hollow-eyed and grinning in a way that suggested madness had finally overtaken what little sanity remained. The suit's midsection featured large tears that exposed Afton's mummified ribcage, the bones still somehow held together despite decades of decay. Most disturbingly, his feet had only 3 toes, a design element that matched footprints from certain minigames and suggested this might be a different Spring Bonnie model from the one that became Springtrap. The question of how Afton transferred between suits spawned numerous theories. Some suggested he'd simply switched costumes, pulling his remains from the original Springtrap and putting them into this new suit. Though that seemed physically impossible given how thoroughly the spring locks had impaled him. Others proposed that his spirit jumped between suits, the way the children's spirits inhabited different animatronics. That possession wasn't tied to physical presence, but to some form of spiritual resonance or remnant signature. Still, others wondered if this wasn't a transfer at all, but rather revealed that there had always been multiple William Aftons, multiple iterations of his consciousness existing simultaneously in different forms. Regardless of how the transition occurred, Scraptrap appeared in the alleyway behind Henry Emily's pizzeria trap, drawn there along with the other haunted animatronics by circumstances Henry had carefully orchestrated. This final location, disguised as another attempt to open a Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, was actually designed to lure every remaining haunted animatronic into one place where they could be destroyed together. Henry, having finally decided to end the nightmare his creations had become, built a labyrinth beneath the pizzeria and created incentive for the player to bring haunted animatronics from the alley into this maze, supposedly for use in the new restaurant, but actually to ensure they'd all be present for the final fire. Scraptrap's behavior during Pizzeria Simulator showed that Afton's intelligence and cunning persisted despite his deteriorated form. During salvage sequences, the player would find Scraptrap in the alley and have to determine if he was safe to bring into the facility or if he posed too much danger. Audio tests and movement monitoring revealed his true nature to anyone paying attention. But the lure of a rare animatronic pushed most players to take the risk and bring him inside regardless. This paralleled how Fazbear Entertainment throughout its history had prioritized profit over safety, continued operating despite knowing their animatronics were dangerous, and repeated the same mistakes in new iterations. Once inside the pizzeria's underground maze, Scraptrap would move through vents and corridors toward the office where the player sat managing their restaurant simulation by day and defending against animatronic attacks by night. The sound of his footsteps clicking through vents created tension, as did the occasional motion detector alerts that showed him getting closer. You could make sounds to lure him away temporarily, but he'd always come back, always keep searching for the office, driven by Afton's recognition that this was another night guard, another potential victim, another soul he could harm. Scraptrap's voice, heard during Ultimate Custom Night, where he appeared alongside other animatronics in a hellish amalgamation of the player's worst challenges, gave players their first clear words from William Afton himself. Lines like, "I always come back," became iconic, summarizing his refusal to die, his persistence across decades and death itself, his determination to remain present in the narrative no matter how many times he should have been finished. Other lines referenced his crimes, his awareness of what he'd done, his lack of remorse even after suffering for so long. These weren't the words of someone who'd learned from punishment. These were the words of a being who'd been broken down to his essential nature and found that nature was irredeemably evil. But Pizzeria Simulator finally brought consequences Afton couldn't escape. Henry's speech during the final night, delivered in a voice recording that played as flames began to consume the building, addressed each animatronic present, including Scraptrap directly. Henry spoke about the wound Afton had inflicted on him years ago by killing his daughter Charlie, about how that wound had festered and spread, creating more victims, more tragedy, more suffering. He acknowledged Afton's intelligence and cunning, but dismissed it as irrelevant in the face of what was about to happen. The building was designed as a furnace, a trap that would incinerate everything inside at temperatures high enough to destroy even remnant-infused material. Henry described a special place in hell reserved for Afton, and while this was perhaps metaphorical, Ultimate Custom Night suggested it might have been literal. As flames rose around them, as heat consumed everything including the facility's metal and concrete structure, Scraptrap burned. Whether this finally killed William Afton's spirit, whether it freed him to face whatever judgment awaited beyond physical existence, whether it succeeded where previous fires had failed, these questions remained debated among fans, even as later games suggested his influence persisted in digital forms. The ending images from Pizzeria Simulator showed gravestones for the children whose spirits had finally been freed. Gabriel, Jeremy, Susie, Fritz, and Cassidy, their names confirmed through various clues and arranged in positions that matched animatronic heads from earlier endings. Charlie's grave sat on a hill overlooking the others, her spirit having watched over them even in death, her role as the puppet finally complete. These spirits found peace in the flames, but Afton's fate remained ambiguous. No gravestone marked his passing, because perhaps he never truly passed. Even destruction might not be enough to stop him. Scraptrap's design divided the fan community more than any other Bonnie variant. Some appreciated the nightmarish quality of his appearance, the way his exposed skull and deteriorated state emphasized his inhuman persistence. Others felt the design departed too far from Springtrap's aesthetic, that the loss of the dirty golden color and the changes to body proportions made Scraptrap feel like a different character rather than a continuation. The debate extended to questions about lore consistency, about whether it made sense for Afton to switch suits, about what that switch meant for his character and his obsessions. Despite aesthetic controversies, Scraptrap's role in the narrative was clear. He represented the final gathering, the moment when all of Fazbear Entertainment's sins came home to roost in one location. Henry's plan required every major haunted animatronic to be present. Baby, Elizabeth Afton, Molten Freddy, the Funtime animatronics fused together, Lefty, the puppet Charlie Emily, and Scraptrap, William Afton himself. This was a family reunion of the worst kind, bringing together victims, villain, and the creator who felt responsible for enabling everything that had happened. Only through gathering them all could Henry ensure he destroyed the cycle completely, that no haunted remnants remained to start new horrors. Scraptrap's presence in Ultimate Custom Night, which appears to take place in some form of Afton's personal torment or nightmare state, showed him at maximum aggression. His AI could be set to the highest difficulty, making him one of the most challenging animatronics to manage, while simultaneously dealing with dozens of other threats. This reflected his role in the overall story. Always dangerous, always persistent, always refusing to be ignored even when circumstances suggested he should be finished. The voice lines Afton spoke in Ultimate Custom Night gave rare insight into his mindset. He referenced his survival, his continual return, his awareness of his situation. Lines like, "Let's see how many times you can be pulled apart and put back together," suggested he understood the nature of remnant and possession, that he'd experienced being pulled apart literally through the springlock failure and metaphorically through his transition to Scraptrap. He'd been through a form of death and return that gave him perspective on existence few beings could claim, and that perspective hadn't led to remorse or growth. It had just made him crueler, more aware of how to inflict suffering, more committed to his role as villain. Scraptrap's ultimate fate, consumed in Henry's flames, should have been the end of William Afton's physical manifestations, and in a sense it was. Later appearances would be digital constructs, virtual entities, or other forms that lacked the physical presence of Springtrap and Scraptrap. The saga of William Afton trapped in Spring Bonnie suits ended in that fire, destroyed by temperatures that ensured no remnant remained functional. No physical anchor existed for his spirit to cling to. But even in destruction, Scraptrap served as reminder of several important themes. First, evil that goes unpunished for too long becomes harder to stop, requiring more drastic measures. Afton had evaded justice for decades, his crimes multiplying, his influence spreading through remnant experiments and subsidiary tragedies. Stopping him finally required burning down a building with him and everyone connected to him inside. Second, some victories come at terrible cost. Henry stopped Afton, but only by destroying himself. The haunted animatronics, including his own daughter's spirit, and an entire facility. Third, monsters aren't born, they're made through choices, and Afton's choices to pursue immortality and cause suffering had transformed him from a human being into something that barely deserved the classification. Scraptrap also demonstrated how the franchise handled its most important villain. Afton could have been killed off definitively in FNAF 3, his story ending with Springtrap's creation and leaving subsequent games to explore other threats. Instead, Scott Cawthon chose to bring him back, to show that escaping Fazbear's fright wasn't enough to stop him, that he'd persist in new forms and new plots until someone took definitive action. This decision to extend Afton's presence across multiple games made him more memorable, but also risked making him feel overused, like a villain who couldn't stay dead because the story didn't know how to function without him. Pizzeria Simulator's ending attempted to solve this problem by giving Afton's physical form a definitive conclusion. Yes, his digital presence would continue in Help Wanted and beyond, but Scraptrap burned. The Spring Bonnie suits that had served as his prison and his form for decades turned to ash. Whatever remained of William Afton after those flames died down was no longer the twisted fusion of flesh and fabric that had characterized Springtrap and Scraptrap. It was something else, something less tangible, something that would manifest in technology rather than machinery. For Bonnie's story specifically, Scraptrap marked the end of the Spring Bonnie saga's physical manifestation. From the golden rabbit at Fredbear's family diner, to the murderer's disguise, to Springtrap's 30-year imprisonment, to Scraptrap's final burning, the Spring Bonnie suits had been central to the franchise's darkest moments. They'd been used to commit evil, had become prisons for that evil, and finally been destroyed along with the evil they contained. The blue Bonnie who'd started everything might have had a more optimistic eventual fate with Jeremy's spirit freed in the good ending. But Spring Bonnie's golden legacy ended in flames that purified nothing and simply erased what couldn't be redeemed. As we transition now from the Spring Bonnie variants to other iterations of Bonnie across different timelines and locations, remember that Scraptrap represented endings. The end of Afton's physical existence, the end of Spring Bonnie suits serving any purpose in the narrative, the end of the original MCI victim's suffering. Scraptrap burned so the franchise could move forward, could tell new stories, could explore new horrors without remaining chained to the past. Whether that transition succeeded, whether later games managed to create threats as compelling as Afton in his various forms, remains subject to debate. But the intention was clear. Close this chapter conclusively, so new chapters could begin. Toy Bonnie, plastic perfection. In 1987, as Fazbear Entertainment attempted to rebrand and recover from the terrible reputation earned by the original Freddy Fazbear's Pizza location, they opened a new establishment that embraced modern technology and sleek aesthetics to distance themselves from the tragedy and decay of the past. This new location featured the toy animatronics, redesigned versions of the classic characters that traded vintage charm for contemporary appeal. And among these new performers was Toy Bonnie, a reinterpretation of the beloved Blue Rabbit that proved you could make something more obviously artificial while somehow making it more unsettling in the process. Toy Bonnie represented a complete departure from the original's design philosophy, where classic Bonnie had fabric skin that could wear and tear. Toy Bonnie was built with a hard plastic casing in a bright, vibrant blue that seemed to glow under stage lights. His appearance was polished, clean, corporate in its calculated friendliness. Every surface looked manufactured, every curve deliberately designed, every detail planned to appeal to focus groups and marketing departments, rather than created with the organic unpredictability of earlier animatronics. He was meant to be prettier, more approachable, more obviously a product than his predecessor had been. His face bore the most striking changes. Toy Bonnie's eyes were enormous, taking up disproportionate space on his face, with bright green irises and thick black eyelashes that gave him an almost feminine appearance, despite Scott Cawthon confirming he was designed as male. His cheeks featured rosy blush marks like a doll, artificial color painted onto synthetic skin to simulate the flush of health or excitement. 2 black eyebrows sat above his eyes, giving him a more expressive range than the eyebrowless original Bonnie. His buck teeth protruded slightly, 2 large front teeth separated by a small gap that wasn't present in earlier designs but added to his cartoon-like appearance. His muzzle and belly were bright white or pale blue, creating strong contrast with the darker blue of the rest of his body, and his overall proportions were rounder, softer, less threatening in silhouette than the original. Toy Bonnie wore a red bow tie that matched classic Bonnie's, but was rendered in that same hard plastic material as the rest of him, fixed in place rather than the fabric that could shift or wear. He carried a guitar, presumed to be the same one or a similar model to what original Bonnie played, though whether Toy Bonnie actually played it or just held it as a prop remained unclear. The guitar would be left behind in Party Room 3 when he began his nighttime wandering, suggesting it was more aesthetic choice than functional instrument. The toy animatronics, including Toy Bonnie, featured state-of-the-art facial recognition technology linked to criminal databases. This innovation was meant to address concerns about child safety by having the animatronic scan everyone present and alert staff if any registered sex offenders or known dangerous individuals entered the premises. On paper, this seemed like responsible use of technology, a way to make parents feel secure about leaving their children in Freddy's care. In practice, the system created new vulnerabilities and raised disturbing questions about how possessed animatronics interacted with modern programming. Because Toy Bonnie and his companions were tied to this criminal database and designed to detect threats, the spirits that would eventually possess them after another round of murders adapted to the technology. Rather than simply viewing all adults as threats like the original animatronics did, the toy animatronics seemingly inverted their programming, seeing everyone not in the database as suspicious. Or perhaps the possession simply corrupted the system, turning protective instincts into hunting behavior. Either way, Toy Bonnie became aggressive at night, using his advanced mobility and the very technology meant to keep children safe as tools to hunt security guards who'd done nothing wrong except take a job at the wrong restaurant. Toy Bonnie's movement pattern in FNAF 2 made him one of the first and most persistent threats each night. He started on the show stage alongside Toy Freddy and Toy Chica, the three of them standing in that characteristic FNAF pose with Toy Freddy center stage and his companions flanking him. But Toy Bonnie was typically the first to move, leaving the stage and beginning a journey through the new building that used different strategies than his classic counterpart. Rather than moving through main hallways like the original Bonnie, Toy Bonnie preferred the party rooms and vent system. He'd travel from the show stage to various party rooms, sometimes appearing in the main hall, sometimes going directly to the right vent system that led to the office. His approach through the vents meant traditional door defense didn't work. You couldn't block Toy Bonnie with a simple door closure. You had to rely on the Freddy Fazbear mask, wearing that hollow animatronic head to disguise yourself when he appeared in the office or in vents near your position. An unsettling detail about Toy Bonnie's behavior was his eyes. As he got closer to the player, his pupils and irises would visibly shrink, growing smaller and smaller until they were barely visible pinpoints. No other animatronic in FNAF 2 displayed this particular behavior, and no clear explanation exists for why this occurs. Fans have theorized it might reflect something about the spirit possessing him, some predatory instinct manifesting through the plastic shell, while others suggest it could be related to the facial recognition system adjusting its visual sensors as it focused on targets. Whatever the cause, the effect created an unsettling transformation, turning Toy Bonnie's cute, cartoony face into something predatory as those pupils contracted. Unlike most animatronics who maintained consistent appearance, Toy Bonnie never held his guitar during his hunting phase. In Party Room 3, you could see the guitar sitting idle while its player roamed elsewhere. This suggested that whatever drove Toy Bonnie at night, whether possessed child spirit or corrupted programming, didn't care about his daytime role as musician. The guitar was just a prop, another piece of the friendly disguise that could be abandoned when the real work began. This paralleled how the original Bonnie's guitar seemed almost incidental to his character during gameplay. But with Toy Bonnie, it became more obvious, more deliberate. The performance tools discarded the moment performance ended. Toy Bonnie's jump scare when he caught you showed him lunging from the right vent with his arms outstretched, his face suddenly filling your vision as his head snapped forward and that mechanical scream erupted. Despite his prettier appearance, despite his modern design and polished aesthetic, the jump scare was every bit as effective as classic Bonnie's had been. Perhaps more so, because the contrast was greater. Something that looked so friendly, so carefully designed to be non-threatening, suddenly revealing hostile intent created cognitive dissonance that enhanced the horror. The lore surrounding Toy Bonnie connected to the broader tragedy of FNAF 2's location. The Save Them minigame suggested more children were murdered at this new pizzeria. Another round of victims added to William Afton's tally. While the game never explicitly confirmed which spirits possessed which toy animatronics, the implication was clear that Toy Bonnie, like his companions, housed a murdered child spirit. This child would have died more recently than the original MCI victims, killed in what should have been a safer, more modern restaurant, with better security and technology designed to prevent exactly this kind of tragedy. The cruel irony was that the toy animatronics' advanced features, including the facial recognition and increased mobility, made them more dangerous when possessed, Their modern design allowed them to reach parts of the building that older animatronics couldn't access easily. Their networking capabilities meant they could potentially coordinate in ways the isolated originals couldn't. Their slick plastic shells showed damage less obviously than fabric, meaning it was harder to see when something had gone wrong with them. Progress and modernization didn't make anyone safer. It just gave evil new tools to work with. After the location closed due to the Bite of 87 and budget concerns, management decided to scrap the toy animatronics. Phone Guy's messages indicate they plan to dismantle them rather than repurpose them for other locations. This fate meant Toy Bonnie had the shortest operational lifespan of any Bonnie variant, existing only during that brief 1987 period before being decommissioned. What became of the spirits possessing the toy animatronics after their dismantling remains unclear in the game's lore. Toy Bonnie's design influenced the franchise's aesthetic moving forward in subtle ways. The concept of making animatronics more obviously artificial, more plastic and corporate rather than attempting verisimilitude, appeared in later entries. The exaggerated cute features, the bright colors, the doll-like qualities, these elements would recur in various forms. But Toy Bonnie himself became something of a relic, representing a very specific moment in Fazbear Entertainment's history, when they thought new versions could escape old sins. In Ultimate Custom Night, Toy Bonnie returned as a possible threat with unique mechanics. He'd appear in the hallway on camera feeds, and you had to purchase a Bonnie plushie from the prize counter within 20 seconds of his appearance to prevent his attack. This mechanic emphasized his connection to merchandising, to corporate products and brand management. You defended yourself not with doors or lights, but with merchandise, with the products Fazbear Entertainment created to profit from these characters. It was a system that perfectly captured the franchise's themes about corporations prioritizing money over everything, even when that everything included children's lives and supernatural consequences. Toy Bonnie appeared in later games primarily as cameos or recreations. FNAF World included an adventure version of him with cutesy proportions for that RPG's aesthetic. Help Wanted recreated his FNAF 2 behavior in VR, allowing players to experience his hunt in 3 dimensions. Special Delivery, the AR mobile game, made him an event-exclusive animatronic that players could encounter and collect, complete with various skins that gave him Halloween or seasonal themes, while maintaining his core design. The Special Delivery Toy Bonnie also gave the character a voice for the first time, revealing him to have a young, somewhat boastful tone, like a child showing off or competing for attention. Whether this reflected the child possessing him or was just a character choice remained ambiguous, but it added personality to a character who'd been largely silent in his main appearance. The voice suggested insecurity masked by bravado, a need to prove himself, to be noticed, to matter. These traits fit a child who'd been victimized, who'd had their life stolen, who now tried to assert control in the only way available, through threat and violence. The fan community developed interesting relationships with Toy Bonnie, despite his relatively brief canonical appearances. Some fans preferred his design over classic Bonnies, finding the plastic perfection appealing or appreciating the contrast between cute appearance and threatening behavior. Others disliked the departure from the original's aesthetic, feeling Toy Bonnie looked too obviously like a toy, rather than an entertainment animatronic. Gender discussions emerged because of his eyelashes and blush, though again, Scott Cawthon had to clarify the character was meant to be male, designed with features that seemed feminine but weren't intended to indicate gender. Artists enjoyed depicting Toy Bonnie because his cleaner design made him easier to render than the decayed, withered animatronics or the complex original. His bright blue color scheme and the simple plastic panels lent themselves to various art styles, from realistic renders that emphasized his artificial nature to stylized versions that played up his cute aspects. Cosplayers who created Toy Bonnie costumes had to balance making something that looked like hard plastic while still being wearable and comfortable, a challenge that produced some impressive results. Theorists tried to determine exactly who possessed Toy Bonnie, whether the child inside was connected to the original Jeremy who possessed classic Bonnie, or if this was an entirely new victim. The Save Them minigame showed 5 new bodies, suggesting 5 new children murdered similar to the MCI. But exactly which spirit went into which toy animatronic and what happened to those spirits after the toys were scrapped remained mysteries the games never fully clarified. This ambiguity meant Toy Bonnie's story felt incomplete, his existence brief, and his fate uncertain beyond the immediate scrapping after FNAF 2. What Toy Bonnie represented in the broader narrative was Fazbear Entertainment's fundamental misunderstanding of their problems. They thought new animatronics would fix old issues. They thought modern technology and better design would prevent tragedies. They thought people would forget the past if the present looked shiny enough. But the problems at Freddy's weren't cosmetic or technological. They were spiritual, literally in this case, rooted in unresolved murders and vengeful spirits that wouldn't be appeased by plastic shells and facial recognition systems. You couldn't fix haunting with polish and marketing. You certainly couldn't escape William Afton's shadow by pretending newer meant safer. The fact that Toy Bonnie, despite being so explicitly designed to be friendly and modern and safe, still became a threat at night, proved that Fazbear Entertainment had learned nothing. They were doomed to repeat their mistakes not because they didn't try to change, but because they addressed symptoms rather than causes. They worried about how animatronics looked when they should have worried about the murders that kept happening. They invested in technology when they should have invested in justice and accountability. And children kept dying, kept getting stuffed into animatronics, kept becoming vengeful spirits, because nobody in charge was willing to shut down the company and deal with the core rot at its heart. Toy Bonnie's story is a tragedy, but it's a tragedy wrapped in plastic and tied with a bow, packaged to look appealing while concealing the same horrors that had plagued every Bonnie variant. He proved that you could make something prettier but not safer, more modern but not better, more obviously artificial, while still being implicated in very real suffering. And when his time was done, when they scrapped him after only a brief existence, it wasn't because he'd served his purpose. It was because he'd failed in the same ways every animatronic at Freddy's eventually failed, and no amount of plastic polish could save him from that fate. Nightmare Bonnie. Fear made manifest. In the trembling darkness of a child's bedroom where shadows twisted into monsters and every sound promised approaching doom, there existed a version of Bonnie that transcended reality into pure nightmare. Nightmare Bonnie wasn't just scary. He was fear itself given form, the ultimate corruption of the blue rabbit that had started everything, transformed into something that existed solely to terrorize, that had no purpose except to embody every horrible thing a frightened mind could imagine lurking in the dark. Nightmare Bonnie's design threw away any pretense of being an animatronic meant for entertainment. This was a creature, a demon wearing Bonnie's shape like a disguise that fooled no one, because it wasn't meant to fool, only to frighten. His body was dark bluish purple, but the color looked wrong, diseased, like something that had rotted from within. Large sections of his suit were torn away, revealing the endoskeleton beneath. But even these mechanical parts looked organic and wrong, like the interior of some predatory animal rather than robotic components. His chest cavity gaped open in a massive tear that extended from his upper chest down to his hips, exposing ribs and spine that might have been metal but looked disturbingly biological. His hands ended in razor-sharp claws, 5-fingered but tipped with points that could rend flesh. These weren't cartoon claws. They were weapons, sharp and functional, designed with purpose. His right hand and left foot had been completely stripped of fabric covering, showing bare endoskeleton that looked more like a skeleton's bones than mechanical framework. Both kneecaps were missing, with the joints exposed and visible, making his movements seem broken and unnatural as metal ground against metal without any covering to muffle the sound. But Nightmare Bonnie's head was where the true horror lived. His face was separated into 2 parts by some unexplained mechanism, creating a gaping jaw that could open impossibly wide. Inside that jaw were 2 full sets of razor-sharp teeth, inner and outer rows that turned his mouth into a bear trap of gleaming points. His ears were bent at steep angles, torn and tattered with multiple gashes, hanging from his head like wilted flowers. Most disturbing were his eyes, magenta irises that glowed in the darkness, different from the red eyes most nightmare animatronics possessed, set in mechanical sockets that had been stripped bare of any concealing fabric. And his whiskers, thin, wiry protrusions from his cheeks, were the only element that suggested the rabbit he'd been before corruption turned him into something else. Nightmare Bonnie prowled the left hallway of the bedroom in FNAF 4, approaching from shadows that seemed deeper than they should be, moving through darkness with footsteps that echoed too loudly in the small space. His pattern required constant vigilance from the player child. You'd hear him coming if you listened carefully, breathing sounds that grew louder as he got closer. You'd have to rush to the left door when you detected him, shine your flashlight down the hallway to catch him mid-approach, and use that light to send him retreating temporarily. But the flashlight was a limited defense. If you opened the door when he was already at the threshold, if you failed to check frequently enough, if you got distracted by Nightmare Freddy's mini Freddys on the bed, or Nightmare Chica approaching from the other direction, Nightmare Bonnie would slip into the room itself. Once in the bedroom, he became much harder to detect. The only warning would be his breathing, heavy and rasping, animal-like sounds that suggested something alive rather than mechanical. You'd have to hold the left door closed, keeping him at bay through sheer force, waiting for him to give up and leave. But the game never told you explicitly when it was safe to release the door. You had to guess, had to gamble, had to hope that when you finally let go, he'd be gone rather than waiting right outside ready to lunge the moment you relaxed your guard. If you failed, if you opened the door too early or neglected the hallway too long, Nightmare Bonnie's jump scare was instantaneous and brutal. He'd lunge from the doorway or from inside the bedroom itself. His massive jaws opened impossibly wide, those 2 rows of teeth filling your vision as his scream erupted. The jump scare animation showed him actually grabbing the player, lifting them with those clawed hands, a level of physical interaction that made the attack feel more real, more visceral than the stationary cameras had allowed in previous games. Nightmare Bonnie appeared on nights 1 through 4 of FNAF 4, growing progressively more aggressive as the week continued. By night 4, he became relentless, giving you barely any time to check other areas before he'd be back at your door again, demanding constant attention and split-second timing to survive. Night 5 replaced him with Nightmare Fredbear, and from 4 a.m. onward on Night 6, Nightmare Fredbear took over his spawning, but those first 4 nights established Nightmare Bonnie as one of the game's most persistent and terrifying threats. The lore implications of Nightmare Bonnie raised fascinating questions about what he represented. FNAF 4 showed the bedroom of a young child, who the franchise would later suggest was the crying child, the younger son of William Afton, who'd been bullied by his brother and traumatized by the animatronics his father created. The nightmare animatronics that tormented this child could have been hallucinations or constructs spawned from extreme fear. Some evidence points to experimental sound illusion equipment, while hidden details suggest possible gas-induced hallucinations, though the exact nature of these nightmares remains open to interpretation. But they might also have been something more literally real, actual supernatural entities that used the child's fear as anchor points to manifest. The franchise's blurred line between physical and spiritual, real and imagined, meant Nightmare Bonnie could have been any combination of psychological projection, technological manipulation, and genuine paranormal manifestation. He was fear personified, and whether that personification was purely mental or partly physical mattered less than the fact that the crying child experienced him as real, that these nightmares were real to the child suffering through them. Nightmare Bonnie served as corrupted mirror of classic Bonnie. Where classic Bonnie had been possessed by a murdered child spirit and acted from confusion and misplaced aggression, Nightmare Bonnie seemed to have no such excuse. He existed purely to hurt, purely to frighten, with no tragedy underlying his behavior except the tragedy of the child he terrorized. He was what a scared kid imagined when they thought about the animatronics their family owned, amplifying every frightening feature, exaggerating every threatening element, removing any possibility of friendship or fun until only the monster remained. The Halloween edition of FNAF 4 introduced Jacko Bonnie, a reskin of Nightmare Bonnie that replaced him in the Halloween update. Jacko Bonnie had the same mechanics and behavior, but was colored like a jack-o'-lantern, bright orange with a hollow interior that glowed yellow, like candlelight, shining through carved pumpkin skin. His face was missing its endoskeleton head entirely, just an empty void, with light pouring out, creating the impression of a Halloween decoration come to terrible life. Jacko Bonnie behaved identically to Nightmare Bonnie, approaching from the left hallway, requiring the same defensive strategies, jump-scaring with the same brutal efficiency. Jacko Bonnie was officially a non-canon variant, just a seasonal reskin for Halloween fun, but his inclusion suggested interesting things about the Nightmare realm. If Nightmare Bonnie could be recolored and rethemed while maintaining the same essential horror, it implied the nightmares weren't fixed entities, but malleable concepts. The crying child's fear could adapt to different contexts, could take seasonal forms, could be whatever shape manifested from deep terror and imagination combined. This flexibility made the nightmares somehow worse, because it meant there was no defense that would work consistently, no pattern that couldn't shift, no form the horror couldn't take if it suited fear's purposes. Both Nightmare Bonnie and Jacko Bonnie appeared in later games as playable characters in FNAF World, the RPG spin-off that gave everyone cute adventure forms. Adventure Nightmare Bonnie looked adorable compared to his nightmare incarnation, with big eyes and soft proportions that transformed him from terrifying to endearing. This transformation showcased the franchise's ability to take its darkest elements and present them in family-friendly forms for different contexts. But it also raised questions about how the characters viewed themselves within the universe's strange meta-narrative, where they seemed aware of their roles and variations. In Ultimate Custom Night, Nightmare Bonnie returned as one of the purchasable animatronics. He'd appear in the hallway at 1 a.m., 3 a.m., or 5 a.m., and you had 20 seconds to buy his plushie from the prize counter, or he'd attack. This mechanic was shared with other Nightmare animatronics, turning them into a sort of toll system where you had to spend Faz coins to avoid their attacks. The fact that you bought Nightmare Bonnie off with merchandise created dark comedy, as if even nightmares were ultimately subject to capitalist transaction, as if fear itself could be bought and sold for the right price. Help Wanted featured Nightmare Bonnie prominently in its VR experience. The Curse of Dreadbear DLC included him in the Trick or Treat minigame, where players had to wear the correct mask when Nightmare Bonnie appeared at the door. The VR format made him even more imposing because you could see him in 3 dimensions, could appreciate the true scale of his form, could look into his glowing eyes and open jaws while standing in a virtual hallway. The immersion of VR transformed Nightmare Bonnie from something scary on a screen to something that felt present, that activated deeper, more primal fight or flight responses, because your brain struggled to separate virtual presence from physical threat. The hallway crawl section of Curse of Dreadbear used Nightmare Bonnie as an obstacle character. He'd appear from doors on the left as you crawled through darkness, and you had to stop moving before he saw you, or you'd get jump scared. This mechanic captured a particular childhood fear, the freeze response, the desperate hope that staying perfectly still would make the monster pass by. That stillness could equal invisibility. Players who'd grown up checking for monsters in closets or hiding under blankets when shadows looked wrong found this mechanic hit especially hard, triggering memories of their own childhood fears made interactive. Fan artists were drawn to Nightmare Bonnie's design despite or because of its intensity. Some created pieces that emphasized his horror, rendering him in photorealistic detail, or putting him in context that amplified his scariness, like standing over sleeping children or emerging from shadows. Others tried to find humanity in the monster, depicting interactions where he seemed less purely evil and more like a creature acting according to his nature, exploring whether nightmares could have personalities, or if they were just instinct and terror given form. Cosplayers who tackled Nightmare Bonnie faced significant challenges. His design was complex, with all those tears and exposed endoskeleton parts requiring careful construction to look right. His size was imposing, needing height and bulk to capture his threatening presence. And his teeth, those 2 rows of sharp points, had to be rendered in ways that looked dangerous while remaining safe for the cosplayer to see through and move around in. The results, when done well, were spectacular, creating real-life versions of Nightmare Bonnie that were every bit as frightening as the digital model, proving that practical effects could still compete with CGI for creating visceral fear. Nightmare Bonnie represented Scott Cawthon's design philosophy, evolved to its logical extreme. If the original Bonnie gave Scott nightmares because of the uncanny valley effect and his surprising scariness, despite simple design, Nightmare Bonnie was that fear polished and weaponized. He was Bonnie with all constraints removed, all friendly elements stripped away, leaving only the pure horror that had lurked beneath the surface all along. He proved that the Blue Rabbit could be terrifying not just through jump scares and behavior, but through raw design, through being shaped specifically to trigger every instinctive fear response humans had evolved. The community debates about whether the nightmare animatronics were real or imagined, whether they had some physical presence or existed purely as hallucinations, missed a key point about characters like Nightmare Bonnie. To the crying child suffering through those nights, reality didn't matter. The terror was real. The danger felt real. Whether Nightmare Bonnie could physically harm him or could only attack in nightmare logic didn't change the fundamental experience of being a small child facing something vast and malevolent in the darkness of his own bedroom, with nowhere to run and no one to help. Nightmare Bonnie embodied a particular kind of horror that FNAF excelled at, taking symbols of childhood joy and corrupting them into sources of terror. Bonnie should have been a friendly musician, a character who made kids smile at birthday parties. Instead, in nightmares, he became a stalking monster with too many teeth and eyes that glowed with hunger or madness. This inversion, this transformation of the familiar into the threatening, created cognitive dissonance that enhanced the fear. Part of your brain still recognized Bonnie, still associated him with Freddy Fazbear's Pizza and entertainment and fun, and having that recognition clash with the reality of his current monstrous form made everything worse. Nightmare Bonnie also functioned as a warning about what happens when businesses prioritize profit over safety, when fathers prioritize experiments over family, when society allows vulnerable children to remain in dangerous situations. The crying child's nightmares were partly self-generated, but they were seeded by genuine experiences of fear at his father's pizzeria, genuine trauma from bullying by his brother, genuine exposure to the animatronics that had killed other children. Nightmare Bonnie was what happened when childhood trauma had nowhere to process except inward, where it fermented and grew until the child's own mind turned against him, creating monsters from misunderstood reality. As we move forward from Nightmare Bonnie to explore his more recent iterations, remember what he represented: fear in its purest form, uncut and unrestrained. He proved that Bonnie's horror potential wasn't limited to subtle uncanniness or story-based dread, but could be presented as obvious, overt, in-your-face terror that still worked, because the fundamentals were sound. And he showed that sometimes the scariest things aren't the ones hidden in shadow, but the ones that come charging directly at you with jaws open wide and no mercy in their glowing eyes. The nightmares that don't pretend to be anything except what they are. Glamrock Bonnie, the absent star. In the modern era of Fazbear Entertainment, where the old pizzerias had been replaced by a sprawling mall-like complex called Freddy Fazbear's Mega Pizzaplex, a new generation of animatronics performed for crowds that numbered in the thousands. The glamrock animatronics represented the franchise's latest evolution. Sleeker designs, advanced AI, celebrity personas that went beyond simple mascots to become full characters with personalities and relationships. And among them should have been Glamrock Bonnie, the bassist whose absence from the main game spoke louder than his presence could have. Glamrock Bonnie was described through fragments and remnants, through old posters and disused areas, through the sadness in Glamrock Freddy's voice when he mentioned his missing friend. He'd been light blue, a colour somewhere between the deep blue purple of classic Bonnie and the bright blue of toy Bonnie. His design incorporated 80s rock aesthetics with a modern twist. A red jumpsuit featuring a gold star on the chest and purple lightning bolt patterns on the sides, matching blue leg warmers and gloves, a blue headband, and spiked bracelets on both arms similar to Freddy's accessories. Between his ears sat a small tuft of hair, giving him a more organic, less purely mechanical appearance than previous iterations. On his right ear hung a dark blue earring that matched his shoulder pads and other accents, and around his neck he wore a dark blue bandana. Most significantly, Glamrock Bonnie's design emphasized his relationship with Freddy through matching earrings and a poster that appeared in the Pizzaplex, showing them together with the phrase, "You and me forever and ever. Love, Freddy." This wasn't just friendship. This was a bond depicted as central to both characters' identities, a partnership that went beyond simply being bandmates to something deeper and more meaningful. The merchandising and theming around Bonnie Bowl, the bowling alley attraction dedicated to Glamrock Bonnie, suggested he was beloved by both his fellow animatronics and the public. But Glamrock Bonnie never appeared during the events of Security Breach's main game. When Gregory and Freddy explored the Pizzaplex, Bonnie was already gone, replaced by Montgomery Gator as the band's bassist. The game offered only hints about what happened through maintenance logs, employee messages, and environmental storytelling. Records showed Bonnie's last known location was Monty's Gator Golf, the attraction where Montgomery performed before joining the main band. After that, he disappeared, declared out of commission by management in language carefully chosen to avoid explaining what that meant or why it happened. Children asked staff about Bonnie's absence constantly, according to employee messages. They wanted to know where their favorite rabbit had gone, why he wasn't performing anymore, whether he'd come back. Management's response was to slowly erase Bonnie from the Pizzaplex. They removed his imagery from Bonnie Bowl, replacing it with more generic theming. They created a gondola ride in Gator Golf that told a sanitized story about Bonnie retiring and passing his bass guitar to Monty in a friendly transition. They tried to make children forget he'd ever existed, to accept Monty as if he'd always been part of the band. But you couldn't completely erase someone who'd been that central to the Pizzaplex's identity. Bonnie Bowl still bore his name, even if the decorations had changed. Old posters remained on walls in less trafficked areas. A small stage in the ice cream parlor of Bonnie Bowl sat closed with an out-of-order sign, reminiscent of Pirate Cove's treatment in the original game. A space that had been Bonnie's, but now stood empty and forgotten. And most telling, Freddy remembered. When Gregory brought Freddy to that closed stage, the bear would mention that he no longer visited this spot, that he missed Bonnie, his voice heavy with a sadness that suggested genuine loss rather than simple programming. The truth about Glamrock Bonnie's fate remained hidden until the Ruin DLC, which allowed players to explore a version of the Pizzaplex months after Security Breach's events, now abandoned and decaying. Among the many secrets hidden in this ruined location was a room behind Bonnie Bowl, accessible only by finding and deactivating all the wet floor signbots scattered throughout the building. These small robots, seemingly innocuous maintenance machines, had a strange connection to Bonnie. When all were deactivated, a secret door would open, revealing a room where Glamrock Bonnie's shattered remains lay on the floor. The condition of his body told a story more clearly than any maintenance log could. Glamrock Bonnie had been destroyed brutally. His pelvis was separated from his torso, his legs torn from his body, one leg missing entirely while the other remained attached to the disconnected pelvis. His left arm was broken off. Most telling, his chest bore large claw marks with green paint smudged around the tears, paint that matched Montgomery Gator's color scheme. His back showed similar claw indentations. His head was damaged with part of the left side broken away and wires protruding from the hole. He wasn't just decommissioned, he was murdered. The game developers later confirmed through interviews that Montgomery Gator had indeed destroyed Glamrock Bonnie to take his position in the band. This revelation recontextualized everything players understood about Security Breach's setting. The friendly-looking Pizzaplex, with its bright colors and cheerful atmosphere, had been the site of another animatronic tragedy. Monty, characterized throughout Security Breach as aggressive and temperamental, someone who wanted to be the star instead of supporting Freddy, had apparently seen Bonnie as an obstacle and removed him through extreme violence. The location of Bonnie's body in Bonnie Bowl rather than at Gator Golf, where his last sighting occurred, suggested Monty had moved him after the attack, possibly to hide the evidence, possibly to ensure Bonnie wouldn't be found and repaired in parts and service. That Bonnie ended up in a secret room surrounded by wet floor bots raised additional questions. Were the bots guarding him? Were they trying to preserve his remains? The fact that they had to be shut down to access the room implied some form of protection, though whether they were following Bonnie's final instructions, obeying some ghost in their machine, or simply glitched into guardianship remained unclear. What made Glamrock Bonnie's fate particularly tragic was understanding the relationships it destroyed. Freddy genuinely cared about Bonnie. The matching earrings, the posters, the sadness in Freddy's voice when discussing his friend, all of it suggested something like love. Whether that was programmed friendship or genuine AI emotional capacity. Losing Bonnie hurt Freddy in ways he couldn't fully process, leaving him with grief but no body to mourn, no clear explanation for the absence, just a hole where his closest friend should have been. For Monty, killing Bonnie brought him what he wanted, a place in the main band, but it also defined him as a murderer, someone who'd achieved success through violence rather than merit. His behavior throughout Security Breach, his destructive tantrums and rage issues, took on new meaning knowing he'd killed to get where he was. Whether guilt played any role in his temperament, or if he felt no remorse for what he'd done, remained ambiguous, but the fact that he hid Bonnie's body, rather than leaving it in Gator Golf, suggested some awareness that his actions would be condemned if discovered. The wet floorbots' strange behavior around Bonnie's remains suggested some kind of connection that transcended normal programming. When all the bots were active, Bonnie's eyes glowed yellow in his shattered head, implying some form of power or consciousness flowing through them to him. When they were deactivated, his eyes dimmed, going dark. Interestingly, the game's internal code referred to collecting these bots as gathering collected caution bot souls, which some interpret as indicating spiritual possession, or at least spiritual significance. This could imply that Bonnie's destruction triggered something in these smaller machines, whether through his consciousness fragmenting or some desperate attempt to persist or signal for help. Glamrock Bonnie appeared in Help Wanted 2 as the mascot for the Bonnie Bowl level, showing him intact and functional, suggesting this took place before his destruction, or was simply using his likeness for the game experience. His appearance there allowed players to see what he'd looked like in his prime, to understand what was lost when he was destroyed, to appreciate the design and character that had been reduced to broken parts in a hidden room. The revelation of Glamrock Bonnie's fate sparked intense discussion in the community. Some fans had theorized that Bonnie's parts were used to create Burn Trap, the burned afton form that appeared in Security Breach's cut ending. But the Ruin DLC's inclusion of his intact remains disproved that theory. Others had speculated about various accidents or malfunctions, but none had quite predicted the brutality of Monty's betrayal. The fact that an animatronic could murder another animatronic with apparent premeditation raised questions about the sophistication of Glamrock AI, about how much consciousness these machines truly possessed. It also raised darker questions about Fazbear Entertainment's management. They knew what happened. They had security footage of Bonnie entering Gator Golf. They must have found his body, or at least discovered he was destroyed. But instead of investigating, instead of decommissioning Montgomery, or even acknowledging what occurred, they covered it up. They spun a story about retirement, erased evidence of Bonnie's presence, promoted Monty to the main stage, and let the whole situation slide in service of keeping the Pizzaplex operational and profitable. It was classic Fazbear Entertainment. Prioritize business over everything, hide bodies, erase victims, pretend everything was fine while darkness festered beneath cheerful surfaces. For Bonnie's story specifically, Glamrock Bonnie represented what could have been. Unlike most Bonnie variants who were either possessed by murdered children or corrupted by William Afton's crimes, Glamrock Bonnie appeared to have been innocent, just an advanced AI trying to do his job and be friends with Freddy. His destruction wasn't linked to the missing children incident or remnant experiments or supernatural possession. It was simple mechanical violence. One animatronic wanting what another had and taking it through force. This made Glamrock Bonnie's death feel even sadder in some ways, because it was so preventable. If Montgomery had been properly monitored, if management had addressed his aggressive tendencies, if security systems had intervened when he attacked Bonnie, if literally anyone in a position of authority had cared enough to stop it, Glamrock Bonnie would still be performing at the Pizzaplex, still playing bass for crowds, still hanging out with Freddy. Instead, he was parts in a hidden room, mourned by one friend and forgotten by everyone else, because remembering him was inconvenient for business. The phrase "out of commission" that management used to describe Bonnie's status took on sinister meaning, knowing what it really meant. It wasn't a euphemism for retirement or deactivation. It was corporate speak for brutally murdered, and we're covering it up. When employees asked about Bonnie in internal messages, when children kept inquiring about their favorite character, when Freddy clearly grieved his missing friend, management's response was always the same. Minimize, deflect, erase, move on. Never acknowledge what actually happened. Never admit that they'd allowed an animatronic to be destroyed on their watch and promoted his killer to stardom. Glamrock Bonnie's absence haunted Security Breach in ways that presence couldn't have achieved. If he'd simply been another animatronic, another threat to avoid, or another character to encounter, he'd be one element among many. But as the missing piece, as the hole in the lineup that Freddy felt and children noticed, and the environment itself referenced through Bonnie Bowl and closed stages, he became more significant than any new character they could have created. His absence asked questions. What happened? Why won't anyone talk about it? Why does Freddy sound so sad? And when Ruin finally provided answers, those answers confirmed what many players feared, that even in this modern setting with advanced technology and sophisticated animatronics, Fazbear Entertainment's fundamental nature hadn't changed. They still covered up deaths, still prioritized profit over justice, still let innocent parties suffer while protecting the guilty if it served their interests. The glamorous surface of the Pizzaplex, its mall-like spaces and celebrity animatronics and high-tech attractions concealed the same rot that had plagued every Freddy's location throughout history. For fans who'd followed the franchise since its beginning, Glamrock Bonnie's fate hit hard because it showed how little had changed. New generation, new technology, new aesthetic, same tragedies. Bonnie variants kept suffering across timelines and iterations. Jeremy's spirit trapped in the original, the faceless horror of withered Bonnie, Spring Bonnie becoming Springtrap and Scraptrap. And now this, an innocent AI brutally destroyed by a jealous colleague while management covered it up. Being Bonnie meant tragedy across every version of the character, as if the name itself carried a curse that no incarnation could escape. Glamrock Bonnie never got the chance to become the character he should have been. His story ended before it began, cut short by violence and buried by indifference, leaving only fragments and memories and the eternal question of what might have been if anyone in power had cared enough to protect him. He was potential unrealized, friendship interrupted, performance ended mid-song. And in a franchise defined by loss and suffering, his particular loss felt unique precisely because it was so mundane, so preventable, so sadly typical of how Fazbear Entertainment had always operated, sacrificing individuals for collective profit without hesitation or remorse. Conclusion and the legacy of the rabbit. As we reach the end of our journey through the many faces, forms, and fates of Bonnie the Rabbit, it's worth pausing to consider what this single character has meant to the Five Nights at Freddy's franchise, and why his story, across all its iterations and tragedies, has resonated so deeply with millions of players worldwide. From that first game, where the blue rabbit stalked the left hallway, giving Scott Cawthon nightmares during development, to the faceless horror of withered Bonnie that pushed animatronic decay to its most disturbing extreme, through the golden spring Bonnie suits that became William Afton's tool and tomb, into the plastic modernity of Toy Bonnie and the pure nightmare horror of Nightmare Bonnie, finally arriving at the absent tragedy of Glamrock Bonnie, whose destroyed remains told a story more powerful than any jump scare. Bonnie has been there at every turn, present in every era, suffering through every variation of the franchise's core themes about entertainment corrupted and innocence destroyed. Bonnie proved that horror doesn't require complexity. Sometimes the simplest designs become the most effective. A blue rabbit with a red bow tie and a guitar shouldn't be scary. But Scott Cawthon's instincts about what made him frightening were proven correct by the franchise's massive success and Bonnie's enduring position as one of the series' most iconic threats. His effectiveness came from that contrast between friendly appearance and hostile behavior, between expectations and reality, between what he was supposed to be and what he became in the darkness of nighttime pizzerias. Each Bonnie variant added layers to our understanding of the franchise's world. Jeremy's spirit possessing the original Bonnie taught us about possession mechanics and the missing children incident. Withered Bonnie showed us the consequences of Fazbear Entertainment's neglect and their willingness to cannibalize old animatronics for parts. Spring Bonnie revealed how William Afton committed his crimes and how the springlock technology could become a trap for the killer himself. Toy Bonnie demonstrated that newer and more advanced didn't mean safer or better. Nightmare Bonnie explored the psychological horror of childhood fears made manifest, and Glamrock Bonnie, through his absence and eventual discovery, proved that even in modern settings with advanced technology, the same patterns of violence and cover-up persisted. Throughout all these variations, Bonnie remained Bonnie, the guitarist, the left hallway stalker, the blue rabbit, who seemed like he should be friendly but never quite was. The character who gave his creator nightmares and then gave those nightmares to millions of players. Who became shorthand for a particular kind of dread that comes from seeing familiar things twisted into threats. Who proved that mascot characters designed for children's entertainment could be terrifying precisely because of that innocent facade. If you've enjoyed this deep exploration of Bonnie's lore across the entire Five Nights at Freddy's franchise, please take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel. Your support allows me to continue creating these comprehensive, sleep-friendly lore videos that let you learn about your favorite horror games while drifting off peacefully. Leave a comment letting me know which Bonnie variant was your favorite, or which one scared you the most, or if there are other characters from the franchise you'd like to see explored in this depth. I read every comment, and your feedback shapes future content. Bonnie the Rabbit will always hold a special place in Five Nights at Freddy's history. He was the first animatronic Scott created, the one that defined what this series would become. The character whose simple existence proved that indie horror could compete with big-budget productions by understanding what actually frightens people. His legacy isn't just in the jump scares he's delivered or the nightmares he's inspired. It's in demonstrating that horror works best when grounded in genuine emotion, in tragedy and loss and suffering that resonates even when filtered through the absurdist lens of haunted pizza restaurant animatronics. As you drift off to sleep with this knowledge settling into your mind like gentle snow, remember that Bonnie's story, across all its variations and timelines, was fundamentally about children who suffered and adults who failed to protect them, about companies that prioritize profit over safety, about how evil persists through generations and iterations, always finding new forms, but remaining essentially unchanged at its core. Remember that behind every horror in this franchise stood human choices, human cruelty, or human negligence that allowed nightmares to flourish. And remember most of all that Bonnie, in every form, was both victim and threat, both the monster and the child trapped inside the monster, both the corruption of innocence and the evidence that innocence once existed. His story is the franchise's story in miniature, and understanding him means understanding why Five Nights at Freddy's became the phenomenon it did, why it spawned books and games and movies and endless theories, why it captivated imaginations and inspired fear and creativity in equal measure. So sleep well. Let the tales of the blue rabbit fade into dreams that are hopefully less nightmare than the ones he inhabited. And know that we've honored every iteration of this character's existence by examining it thoroughly and treating his story with the respect it deserves. Bonnie the Rabbit came back in many forms across many games, and his legacy will continue as long as people remember that first night, that first jump scare, that first moment when a friendly-looking animatronic proved that appearances could be deadly and darkness could wear a smile. Thank you for listening, and until next time, sleep tight and don't let the animatronics bite.